The cold October rain fell in sheets across the churned earth of the Meuse Argonne Forest. Autumn had turned the battlefield into a quagmire of mud and blood, where men and machines struggled against both the elements and enemy fire. Through the mist and smoke, the silhouettes of America's newest weapons of war emerged like mechanical beasts from prehistoric times. Colonel Thomas Iron Tom Sullivan squinted through the narrow vision slit of his Renault FT-17 tank. At 45, he was older than most of the men under his command, his weathered face bearing the lines of a man who had seen too much in too short a time. Before the war, he had been one of Ford's brightest engineers, helping to revolutionize the assembly line. Now he was applying that same mechanical genius to the art of modern warfare. "Driver, advance," Sullivan ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos erupting around them. The small French-built tank lurched forward, its narrow track struggling to find purchase in the mud. Behind him, a dozen more tanks of the American 304th Tank Brigade followed, their engines roaring in defiance against the German artillery that sought to halt their advance. Sullivan had waited for this moment. After months of planning and preparation, the Americans were finally deploying their armored forces en masse against the German defenses. The objective was to break through the Hindenburg Line and end the stalemate that had claimed so many lives. Despite his years of experience with machinery, nothing had prepared Sullivan for the claustrophobic horror of tank combat. The interior of the Renault was cramped, hot, and filled with the acrid smell of cordite and engine oil. Every impact against the hull sent shockwaves through the metal, jarring the crew's bones and rattling their nerves. "German machine gun nest, 2 o'clock, shouted Private Jenkins. The gunner squeezed beside Sullivan in the turret. Sullivan rotated the turret, feeling the resistance of the hand-cranked mechanism as he brought their 37mm cannon to bear on the target. "Fire when ready," Sullivan commanded, his eyes never leaving the vision slit. The cannon roared to life, the muzzle flash momentarily blinding him. Through the clearing smoke, Sullivan saw the machine gun nest erupt in a shower of dirt and splintered wood. German soldiers scattered, some falling, others retreating toward their secondary positions. The advance continued, yard by bloody yard. Sullivan's tank battalion was making progress, but at a terrible cost. To his right, one of the tanks burst into flames, hit by a direct shell from a German field gun. Through his periscope, Sullivan watched in horror as the crew tried to escape through the hatches, some of them engulfed in flames. "Keep moving," Sullivan ordered his driver, swallowing the bile rising in his throat. "We can't stop now." The German defensive line loomed ahead, a network of trenches, barbed wire, and reinforced bunkers. Intelligence had reported these positions were manned by hardened veterans of the Eastern Front, men who had faced Russian charges and held their ground, but they had never encountered American tanks before. As they approached the first line of trenches, Sullivan felt a tremendous impact against the right side of his tank. The Renault shuddered violently and warning shouts filled the cramped compartment. "We're hit, Colonel," the driver yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Engines losing power." Sullivan assessed this damage quickly. A German armor-piercing round had penetrated the right side of the tank, damaging the engine compartment. Black smoke began to fill the interior, and the temperature rose dangerously. "Keep her moving as long as you can," Sullivan ordered, knowing that a stationary tank was a dead tank. The driver nodded grimly, wrestling with the controls as the damaged engine sputtered and coughed. They managed to reach the German trench line before the engine finally died. Sullivan's tank now sat exposed atop the enemy position, a prime target for German gunners. Through the vision slits, Sullivan could see German soldiers emerging from dugouts and firing at his immobilized vehicle. "Prepare to abandon tank," Sullivan commanded, reaching for his Colt pistol. "Jenkins, cover the right. Miller, left flank. We're not dying in this iron coffin." As Sullivan prepared to open the hatch, another shell struck the tank, this time penetrating the armor completely. White-hot pain seared through Sullivan's left leg and side as shrapnel tore into him. The world turned sideways, then dark, as he collapsed against the turret wall. Consciousness returned to Sullivan in painful bursts. The interior of the tank was now an inferno, flames licking at the ammunition stores. With superhuman effort, Sullivan pulled himself toward the hatch, dragging his injured leg behind him. "Out, everyone out!" he shouted, though he couldn't tell if any of his crew were still alive to hear him. Sullivan pushed open the top hatch, smoke billowing around him. German bullets pinged off the metal as he emerged, exposed to enemy fire. Using his remaining strength, he pulled himself onto the hull of the tank. the metal scorching his hands through his gloves. From this vantage point, he could see the battle unfolding across the muddy landscape. Some of his tanks had broken through, while others burned like funeral pyres, marking the advance of the American forces. With no time to dwell on the losses, Sullivan slid down the side of the tank into the German trench, landing hard on his injured leg. Pain shot through his body, but adrenaline kept him moving. He drew his pistol, ready to face any German soldiers who might be waiting. The trench was surprisingly empty, most of its defenders having retreated to secondary positions or been killed in the initial bombardment. Sullivan began to make his way along the trench, searching for survivors from his crew. The sounds of battle raged above, but down in the earth there was an eerie quiet broken only by the distant thump of artillery and the groans of the wounded. Around a corner of the zigzagging trench, Sullivan encountered a German officer, slumped against the mud wall, blood soaking through his Feldgrau uniform. The man's eyes widened at the sight of the American colonel, and he weakly raised a Luger pistol. Sullivan reacted instinctively, knocking the weapon aside before it could be fired. The German's strength was failing. He wouldn't have been able to pull the trigger anyway. Up close, Sullivan was surprised by the man's youth. Despite his officer's insignia, he couldn't have been more than 30. "Bitte," the German officer whispered, his face contorted in pain. "Please." Sullivan hesitated. The man was clearly dying, a massive wound in his abdomen. In broken German, Sullivan asked, "What's your name, soldier?" "Hauptmann Klaus Weber," the German replied, his breath coming in short gasps. "Engineer, Dresden." An engineer like himself, Sullivan felt a strange kinship with this dying enemy officer. In another life, they might have collaborated on projects, shared ideas over drafting tables. "Hold on, Weber," Sullivan said, applying pressure to the wound. "Our medics will be coming through soon." Weber shook his head weakly. "Too late for me, American." "But this." He reached inside his blood-soaked jacket and withdrew a small leather case. "Plans, new tank design, too important to be lost." Sullivan took the case, curiosity overcoming his caution. Inside were detailed technical drawings of a tank unlike any he had seen before. Even with his cursory glance, Sullivan could tell these designs were revolutionary. "Why give this to me?" Sullivan asked, suspicion mixing with professional interest. Weber coughed, blood speckling his lips. "War is ending. Future coming. Machines like these will change everything, better in hands of engineer than generals." His eyes, already growing dim, focused on Sullivan one last time. "You are engineer, yes? I can tell." Before Sullivan could respond, the sound of approaching American soldiers echoed down the trench. Weber's eyes closed, his breathing shallow. "Medic!" Sullivan shouted, waving to the advancing Americans. "I need a medic here." The American soldiers approached cautiously, rifles trained on the wounded German. Sullivan waved them down, tucking the leather case into his own jacket. "This man needs medical attention," Sullivan ordered, "and I need to get back to my battalion." As medics began to work on Weber, Sullivan made his way back toward the American lines, using a discarded rifle as a makeshift crutch. His own wounds were serious, but not immediately life-threatening. The leather case pressed against his chest, the designs within already sparking ideas in his engineer's mind. The battle continued to rage, but for Sullivan, something had fundamentally changed. In that muddy trench, facing a dying enemy who was more like him than different, the future of warfare had been placed in his hands. He didn't know if Weber would survive or what would come of those designs, but he felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. By nightfall, the American forces had secured their objectives, pushing the German army back several miles. Sullivan, now receiving treatment in a field hospital, learned that his actions had helped secure a vital section of the German defenses. Of the 12 tanks in his battalion, only 5 had survived the engagement. The human cost was equally high. As morphine dulled his pain and drew him toward unconsciousness, Sullivan's thoughts returned to the leather case now secured beneath his cot. Even in his drug-induced haze, his engineer's mind was already improving on Weber's designs, envisioning the next generation of armored warfare. The last thing Sullivan saw before darkness claimed him was the face of Klaus Weber, not as an enemy, but as a fellow creator caught in the machinery of war. 2 men from opposite sides, united by the belief that the future belonged to those who could build it rather than those who would destroy it. Winter had settled over Washington, D.C. by the time Colonel Thomas Sullivan was well enough to leave Walter Reed Army Hospital. 3 months of surgeries and rehabilitation had saved his leg, though doctors warned he would always walk with a limp. The physical wounds were healing, but the invisible scars of combat remained. Nightmares plagued his sleep, filled with the sounds of grinding metal and the screams of burning men trapped in iron coffins. During the day, sudden noises would trigger memories of shell impacts, causing him to flinch or duck for cover. The doctors called it shell shock, but Sullivan recognized it for what it was, the mind's inability to forget what the body had endured. On a cold December morning in 1919, Sullivan sat on the edge of his hospital bed, carefully pulling on his uniform. The war had been over for more than a year, and America was changing rapidly. Prohibition had begun, women had finally won the right to vote, and returning soldiers were trying to find their place in a country eager to forget the horrors of the Western Front. A soft knock at the door interrupted Sullivan's thoughts. Before he could respond, the door opened to reveal General John J. Pershing himself, commander of the American Expeditionary Forces. Sullivan immediately attempted to stand at attention, but Pershing waved him back down. "At ease, Colonel," Pershing said, closing the door behind him. "This isn't an official visit." Sullivan relaxed slightly, though the presence of America's highest-ranking military officer still filled him with a mix of pride and apprehension. Pershing pulled up a chair and sat across from Sullivan, studying him with keen eyes that had overseen the mobilization of millions of American troops. "You're looking better," Pershing observed. "The doctors tell me you'll be discharged next week." "Yes, sir," Sullivan replied, "though they say I should consider a desk job from now on." Pershing nodded thoughtfully. "As it happens, I have something in mind, something that would make excellent use of your unique combination of skills." Sullivan raised an eyebrow. Before the war, he had been one of Henry Ford's top engineers, helping to revolutionize mass production techniques. During the conflict, he had become one of the Army's foremost experts on tank warfare, learning through trial and bloodshed the strengths and weaknesses of armored combat. "Sir?" Sullivan prompted when Pershing fell silent. Pershing leaned forward, lowering his voice. "What I'm about to tell you is classified, Colonel. During the final months of the war, our forces captured several modified Renault tanks from the Germans. These weren't standard captures. They had been extensively reworked by German engineers." Sullivan's mind flashed to the dying German officer Weber and the leather case of designs he had been given. The case now resided in Sullivan's footlocker, its contents memorized but untouched since his return to America. "I'm familiar with German modifications, sir," Sullivan said carefully. "Their engineers made significant improvements to the French designs." Pershing's eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, I thought you might know something about that. Your after-action reports were quite detailed in their technical assessments." A moment of silence hung between them, both men aware that Sullivan hadn't disclosed everything about his encounter in the German trench. Finally, Pershing continued, "The War Department has authorized a small, classified program to develop an American tank. Not an adaptation of European designs, but something built from the ground up for our specific needs and terrain. I want you to lead this program, Colonel." Sullivan felt a surge of excitement, quickly tempered by practical concerns. "With all due respect, sir, Congress has been slashing military budgets since the armistice. How would such a program be funded?" Pershing smiled thinly. "You let me worry about the funding. You'll have enough challenges dealing with the technical aspects in the resistance." "Resistance, sir? Not everyone in the Army believes in the future of mechanized warfare, Colonel. Many senior officers still see tanks as expensive novelties, useful in the unique conditions of the Western Front, but impractical for future conflicts. They'd rather invest in traditional cavalry and infantry." Sullivan nodded, understanding immediately. He had encountered this attitude throughout the war, particularly from older officers who couldn't comprehend how fundamentally warfare had changed. "What resources would I have?" Sullivan asked, his mind already cataloging the requirements for such an ambitious project. "A facility outside Baltimore initially. Small staff, modest equipment. You'll need to be discreet and efficient." Pershing stood, signaling the end of the conversation. "If you succeed, there will be more resources. If you fail, the program will be quietly shut down, and tanks will remain European curiosities," Sullivan finished. Pershing nodded. "Exactly, so don't fail, Colonel." He extended his hand. "Do we have an agreement?" Sullivan rose painfully to his feet, ignoring the protest from his injured leg, and shook Pershing's hand firmly. "Yes, sir. When do I start?" "As soon as you're discharged. A car will be waiting." Pershing turned to leave but paused at the door. "One more thing, Colonel. You should know that you have at least one powerful ally in Washington. Congressman Howard Mitchell has been advocating for exactly this type of program. The name was familiar to Sullivan. Mitchell had been a cavalry officer before the war, but unlike many of his peers, he had embraced the potential of mechanized warfare after seeing it firsthand as a military observer in Europe. "I'll be sure to thank the congressman when I see him," Sullivan said. "Do that," Pershing replied, "because you'll need all the allies you can get." After Pershing departed, Sullivan sat back on his bed, mind racing with possibilities. For the first time since returning home, he felt a sense of purpose. The nightmares might continue, and his leg would never fully heal, but he had been given an opportunity to shape the future of American military power. Reaching under his bed, Sullivan pulled out his footlocker and opened it. Beneath layers of personal items and military paperwork lay the leather case given to him by Hauptmann Weber. Sullivan had often wondered if the German officer had survived his wounds. Part of him hoped so, while another part recognized the complication that would create. Opening the case, Sullivan once again studied the detailed technical drawings. Weber had been a visionary, designing a tank that addressed many of the flaws revealed during the war. Better armor distribution, improved engine placement, more effective track design, all captured in meticulous German precision. But Sullivan could already see ways to improve upon these designs, to create something uniquely American, something that combined German engineering, French maneuverability, British durability, and American industrial might. A machine that could change the face of warfare while hopefully making future conflicts less costly in human lives. As Sullivan carefully returned the designs to his footlocker, he made a silent promise. He would build a better tank, not for the generals or politicians, but for the young men who would otherwise die in trenches in some future war. Men like the crews he had lost in the Argonne Forest, burned alive or cut down when they abandoned their disabled vehicles. The weather matched Sullivan's mood as he arrived at the facility outside Baltimore a week later. Gray skies released a steady drizzle, turning the gravel driveway into a muddy track that reminded him too much of the battlefield. The facility itself was hardly impressive, a former automotive factory requisitioned during the war and never returned to its original owners. Sullivan's driver, a young corporal who had been too late to see combat, navigated the muddy approach with visible effort. "Sorry about the conditions, Colonel," the corporal said, gesturing to the dilapidated buildings. "Place has been abandoned since the armistice." "It's not the facilities that matter, son," Sullivan replied, though privately he wondered how he was expected to develop cutting-edge military technology in what amounted to a glorified garage. "It's the people." As if on cue, a figure emerged from the main building, hunched against the rain. Sullivan recognized him immediately, though they hadn't seen each other in nearly 3 decades. Samuel "Sam" Reynolds had been ancient when Sullivan first met him as a young engineering student, and the years hadn't been kind. Now approaching his mid-70s, Reynolds was stooped with age. His once powerful frame diminished, but his eyes remained as sharp as the day they had first met. "They dragged you into this madness too, eh?" Reynolds called as Sullivan carefully exited the car, leaning heavily on his cane. "Should have known they'd need both of us to knock sense into these young hotheads." Sullivan couldn't help but smile. Sam Reynolds was a living legend in American military engineering circles. A veteran of the Civil War, he had been designing weapons since before Sullivan was born. His innovations in artillery had helped shape modern warfare, though few outside the Ordnance Department knew his name. "Good to see you, Sam," Sullivan said, clasping the older man's hand. "Didn't know they'd pulled you out of retirement." Reynolds snorted. "Retirement? That was your idea, not mine. Been consulting with the Navy these last few years. Boring work, but it paid the bills." He gestured toward the building behind him. "Come on inside. The rest of your team is waiting, and not all of them are as patient as I am." The interior of the factory was cavernous and cold, the massive space once filled with assembly lines now eerily empty, save for a small section that had been converted into offices and workshops. A group of people stood around a large table covered with blueprints, their animated discussion echoing in the vast space. They fell silent as Sullivan approached, straightening as they noticed his rank insignia. Reynolds made the introductions, starting with a tall, muscular man in his early 30s, whose rumpled appearance and bloodshot eyes suggested a long night with little sleep. "This is Jack O'Malley," Reynolds said, "former engineer with Packard Motor Company, now our resident engine expert. If it has pistons and makes noise, Jack can make it better." O'Malley nodded curtly, his handshake firm but quick. "Colonel," he said, his voice carrying a distinct Boston accent, "hope you're ready to get your hands dirty." Next came a surprising figure, a woman in her late 20s dressed in practical workwear, but with an unmistakable air of academic refinement. Her auburn hair was pinned back severely, and she met Sullivan's gaze with unwavering confidence. Eleanor Wright, she introduced herself before Reynolds could speak. Materials engineering, specializing in metallurgical stress analysis. MIT, class of 13. Sullivan raised an eyebrow but shook her hand without comment. Female engineers were rare but not unheard of, particularly after the war had created opportunities previously closed to women. Still, her presence in a military program was unexpected. Miss Wright's father was James Wright, Reynolds explained, seeing Sullivan's confusion. He and I worked together during the Spanish-American War. When he passed last year, I promised I'd look after his daughter. Turns out she's twice the engineer he ever was. Eleanor's expression didn't change, but her posture straightened slightly at the compliment. Sullivan made a mental note to review her credentials later. If Reynolds vouched for her, that was enough for now. The next introduction brought another surprise. A middle-aged black man stepped forward, his manner reserved but dignified. Dr. Marcus Freeman, Reynolds said, chemistry and material science, taught at Howard University before the War Department recruited him for artillery propellant research. Sullivan shook Freeman's hand, noting the calluses that spoke of practical work alongside academic knowledge. Doctor, he acknowledged, your reputation precedes you. Freeman seemed momentarily surprised by the recognition, then nodded appreciatively. Thank you, Colonel. I look forward to applying my research in a more constructive direction. The final member of the team stood slightly apart from the others, and Sullivan felt a jolt of recognition even before Reynolds spoke. The young man, barely into his 20s, had Sullivan's own eyes and jawline, though his build was leaner and his posture had the distinctive straightness of military academy training. And I believe you already know Cadet Charlie Sullivan, Reynolds said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Recently graduated from West Point, assigned to the Army Air Service, but temporarily seconded to our project as a liaison and test pilot. Sullivan stared at his son, a complex mixture of emotions flooding through him, pride, concern, and no small measure of confusion. Charlie, he said finally, your mother didn't mention this assignment in her letters. Charlie Sullivan stood at attention, his face carefully neutral. It was arranged recently, sir. I requested the transfer when I learned you would be leading the project. The formal response cut deeper than Sullivan expected. He and Charlie had been close once, before the war had taken Sullivan away for nearly 2 years. The distance had grown since his return, made worse by the divorce from Charlie's mother, finalized while Sullivan was still recovering in the hospital. We'll discuss this later, Sullivan said, turning back to address the entire group. For now, I want to thank all of you for joining this project. I won't sugarcoat the challenges ahead. We have limited resources, limited time, and plenty of people hoping we'll fail. He moved to the table, looking down at the blueprints spread across its surface. They were preliminary designs for tank components, some based clearly on the Renault FT-17, others more speculative. Our mission is to design and build a prototype tank that addresses the limitations revealed during the war. It needs to be faster, more reliable, better protected, and most importantly, capable of mass production using American manufacturing methods. Sullivan reached into his briefcase and withdrew Weber's leather case. For a moment he hesitated, aware that what he was about to do skirted the edges of propriety. These were technically captured enemy designs that should have been turned over to military intelligence. But they were also the work of a fellow engineer, entrusted to him personally. I have something that might help us get started, Sullivan said, opening the case and carefully spreading out Weber's drawings alongside the existing blueprints. These are advanced designs developed by a German tank engineer late in the war. They were never implemented, but they address many of the problems we encountered on the battlefield. The team gathered around, professional interest overcoming any reservations about using enemy technology. O'Malley whistled softly as he examined the engine arrangements. This is brilliant, he muttered. Completely rethinks the power-to-weight ratio problem. The armor configuration is innovative as well, Eleanor added, tracing the angled plates with a practiced eye. Deflection principles rather than brute thickness, more protection with less weight. Dr. Freeman studied the material specifications with growing excitement. These alloy compositions, I've been experimenting with similar formulations for aircraft components. With some modifications, they could revolutionize tank armor. As the team discussed the designs, Sullivan caught Charlie studying him rather than the blueprints. His son's expression was unreadable, but there was a question in his eyes that Sullivan wasn't ready to answer. How had he acquired these designs? Why had he kept them secret until now? Where did you get these, Colonel? Dr. Freeman asked, voicing what everyone was thinking. Sullivan hesitated, then decided on a version of the truth. From a German officer during the Meuse-Argonne offensive, he was wounded, believed the war was lost, and wanted his work to survive. He gave them to me just before American medics arrived. And you kept them all this time? Charlie asked, speaking directly to his father for the first time. Shouldn't they have been turned over to intelligence? The question hung in the air, challenging not just Sullivan's decision but his integrity. Before he could respond, Reynolds intervened. In my experience, the old engineer said, military intelligence would have filed these away and forgotten them. Colonel Sullivan recognized their value and preserved them for the right moment. That's why he's in charge of this project and why we're going to succeed where others would fail. Sullivan gave Reynolds a grateful nod, though Charlie's questioning gaze remained fixed on him. Sam's right, he said. We have an opportunity here to leap ahead, to build something that will protect American lives in future conflicts. I'm not interested in bureaucratic niceties. I'm interested in results. He straightened, addressing the team with renewed authority. We'll call this Project Freedom Forge. Our goal is to have a working prototype within 12 months, ready for field testing and evaluation. If we succeed, this could be the foundation of a new branch of the American military. If we fail, we won't fail, O'Malley interrupted, his bloodshot eyes now animated with enthusiasm. Not with these designs as a starting point. And not with this team, Eleanor added, surprising Sullivan with her confidence. Dr. Freeman nodded in agreement. We have everything we need right here. Knowledge, experience, and motivation. Only Charlie remained silent, his expression thoughtful rather than enthusiastic. Sullivan made another mental note to speak with his son privately, to understand why he had requested this assignment and what expectations he brought with him. Let's get to work then, Sullivan said, feeling a spark of the same excitement that had driven him during his days at Ford. Sam, I want you to oversee the overall design integration. Jack, focus on power plant options. Eleanor, armor configurations. Dr. Freeman, materials and fuel systems. Charlie. Sullivan paused, still unsure of his son's role. Charlie filled the silence smoothly. I can serve as test driver and liaison with the Army Air Service. Their experience with aircraft engines might be valuable for our power requirements. Sullivan nodded, impressed despite himself. Good thinking. We'll need all the cross-branch cooperation we can get. As the team dispersed to their assigned stations, Sullivan took a moment to absorb the magnitude of what they were attempting. In this dilapidated factory, with limited resources and a hastily assembled team, they were trying to create a weapon that could change the face of modern warfare. The odds were stacked against them, but looking at the determined faces of his team, Sullivan felt something he hadn't experienced since before the war. Hope. The next morning, Sullivan arrived early to find the factory already buzzing with activity. O'Malley had worked through the night, dismantling a Liberty aircraft engine to assess its potential for adaptation to tank use. Eleanor and Dr. Freeman were engaged in an animated discussion about armor composition, surrounded by material samples and chemical formulas scrawled on a chalkboard. Sam Reynolds sat in a corner, methodically working through calculations with the patience of a man who had been solving engineering problems since before anyone else in the room was born. Only Charlie was absent, which didn't surprise Sullivan. His son had always been an early riser, often disappearing on long runs before dawn. What did surprise him was the sound of an automobile engine approaching outside, followed by the crunch of tires on gravel. Sullivan made his way to the entrance, curious about the unexpected visitor. A sleek black Cadillac had pulled up, its polished surface incongruous against the muddy surroundings. The rear door opened to reveal a distinguished man in his 50s, dressed in an expensive suit that marked him as a Washington insider. Colonel Sullivan, the man called, approaching with hand extended. Congressman Howard Mitchell, I've been looking forward to meeting you. Sullivan shook the proffered hand, immediately recognizing the name. Congressman, General Pershing mentioned you were a supporter of our project. Mitchell smiled, revealing perfect teeth that suggested wealth and privilege. More than a supporter, Colonel. Consider me the guardian angel of American armored warfare. May we speak privately? Sullivan led the congressman inside, finding a small office that had once belonged to the factory's manager. The room was Spartan, containing only a desk, 2 chairs, and a filing cabinet, but it offered the privacy Mitchell had requested. I'll be direct, Colonel, Mitchell said once the door was closed. There are powerful forces in Washington that don't want this project to succeed. Old cavalry officers who see tanks as a threat to their beloved horses. Bureaucrats who fear the budget implications of a new branch of warfare. Isolationists who believe America should disarm now that the war to end all wars is over. Sullivan nodded, unsurprised. General Pershing warned me about resistance. Pershing understands, but even his influence has limits now that the war is over. Mitchell leaned forward, lowering his voice. I've secured your initial funding through a special appropriation buried in the Army Corps of Engineers budget. But to keep the money flowing, you'll need to show progress. Tangible, impressive progress. We've barely started, Sullivan protested. It will take months before we have anything substantial to demonstrate. Mitchell waved away the concern. I'm not talking about next week, Colonel, but 6 months from now, I'll need something I can show to the right people. Something that proves American ingenuity can surpass European designs. Can you give me that? Sullivan considered the request. With Weber's designs as a foundation and the talented team assembled, 6 months might be feasible for a partial prototype. We'll do our best, Congressman, but I won't compromise safety or functionality for the sake of a demonstration. Mitchell smiled again, though this time it didn't reach his eyes. I wouldn't expect you to, Colonel. Your reputation for integrity precedes you. He rose, adjusting his expensive suit. I've arranged for additional equipment to be delivered next week. Machine tools, testing apparatus, metallurgical analysis equipment. Consider it a gesture of my confidence in your team. As they walked back toward Mitchell's waiting car, the congressman paused, looking out across the muddy factory grounds. You know, I was there during the Saint Mihiel offensive. I saw what tanks could accomplish and what they could have accomplished with better design and deployment. The future of warfare rolled across those battlefields, Colonel Sullivan. I intend to ensure America leads that future, not follows it. Sullivan studied the politician with newfound respect. Mitchell wasn't just a budget ally. He was a true believer in armored warfare. Why is this so important to you, Congressman? Mitchell's expression darkened momentarily. I had a son, Colonel, Lieutenant James Mitchell. He died at Belleau Wood charging a machine gun nest with nothing but a rifle and courage. Tanks could have saved him, and thousands like him. The congressman straightened, professional composure returning. But that's enough sentimentality. I expect monthly progress reports, and I'll visit again when you have something worth showing. After Mitchell's departure, Sullivan returned to find the team gathered around Weber's designs, deep in technical discussion. He was about to join them when he noticed Charlie had returned, standing slightly apart, studying a different set of blueprints with intense concentration. Sullivan approached his son, seizing the opportunity for the private conversation they needed. West Point to the Air Service, and now here, he said quietly. Quite a career path you're carving out. Charlie looked up, his expression guarded. I go where I can learn the most, sir. And what do you hope to learn here? Tank design seems far removed from aircraft. Charlie hesitated, then spoke with careful precision. I believe the future of warfare lies in the coordination between air and ground forces. Aircraft can provide reconnaissance and support for armored advances. Understanding both is valuable. It was a good answer, logical and forward-thinking, but Sullivan sensed there was more. And it has nothing to do with working with your father? The question hung between them, loaded with unspoken tensions. Charlie's jaw tightened, so reminiscent of his mother when she was holding back words that Sullivan felt a pang of regret for his failed marriage. I requested this assignment because it's important work, Charlie finally said. And yes, because I thought we might reconnect. After the divorce, after everything, I felt like I barely knew you anymore. Sullivan wasn't prepared for such honesty or for the emotion it stirred. Since returning from war, he had kept his feelings carefully contained, fearing that if he allowed one crack in the dam, everything would flood out uncontrollably. I'm not the same man who left for France, Sullivan admitted. That man died in the mud of Argonne Forest, along with too many good soldiers. I know, Charlie said simply. I've seen it in other veterans. The distant stare, the nightmares, the sudden reactions to loud noises. They call it shell shock, but it's more than that. It's carrying the dead with you. Sullivan studied his son with new eyes. Charlie had been at West Point during the war, graduating just as the fighting ended. He had been spared the horrors of combat, but he clearly understood its aftermath better than Sullivan had given him credit for. This project matters, Sullivan said, gesturing to the bustling activity around them. If we succeed, We might save lives in the next war. Make it shorter, less costly. If there is a next war, Charlie said, they're calling it the war to end all wars. Sullivan laughed, a short, bitter sound. They said the same about the Civil War, son. Ask Sam about that sometime. As long as there are nations and power and resources to fight over, there will be wars. All we can do is try to give our side the advantage. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion near the main entrance. A military truck had arrived, and soldiers were unloading crates under the supervision of a stern-looking officer in the uniform of a lieutenant colonel. Were we expecting a delivery? Charlie asked. Sullivan shook his head, moving toward the entrance with Charlie following close behind. As they approached, Sullivan recognized the officer's insignia, Military Intelligence Division, War Department. Colonel Sullivan, the officer called, stepping forward with a clipboard in hand. Lieutenant Colonel Victor Reed, Military Intelligence. I need to speak with you immediately. Sullivan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February weather. Military intelligence involvement could only complicate their already challenging task. Of course, Colonel Reed, my office is this way. Once inside the small office, Reed wasted no time on pleasantries. I understand you're in possession of German technical documents related to tank design. I'm here to secure those documents for proper analysis and classification. Sullivan maintained a neutral expression, though internally he was calculating rapidly. I'm not sure what you're referring to, Colonel. All our designs are original American work, though naturally influenced by our wartime experience with Allied and captured equipment. Reed's eyes narrowed. Don't play games with me, Sullivan. We have information that you obtained detailed German tank blueprints during the Meuse-Argonne offensive. Those are enemy military assets that should have been turned over to intelligence immediately. Sullivan considered his options carefully. Denying the existence of Weber's designs was pointless now that Reed seemed to have specific information. But surrendering them could cripple the project before it had truly begun. I did receive technical documents from a wounded German officer, Sullivan admitted. In the confusion of battle and my own injuries, they remained in my possession. When General Pershing assigned me to this project, I incorporated those designs into our work, believing that was the best use of captured technology. Reed's expression didn't soften. Those documents need to be properly evaluated and classified. They may contain sensitive information beyond tank designs. They've already been evaluated by me, a qualified engineer with combat tank experience, Sullivan countered. I can assure you they contain nothing but technical specifications relevant to our project. The tension in the small office was palpable. Sullivan was acutely aware that he was treading on dangerous ground, potentially risking his career and the project itself. But something about Reed's manner suggested this wasn't a routine security matter. Who sent you, Colonel Reed? Sullivan asked directly. Because this feels less like security protocol and more like interference. Reed's face flushed with anger. Be careful, Sullivan. Questioning the authority of military intelligence could be construed as insubordination or worse. Before Sullivan could respond, the office door opened and Sam Reynolds entered without knocking. The old engineer took in the scene with a quick glance, then addressed Reed as if continuing an ongoing conversation. Ah, Colonel Reed, I see you've arrived. Did you bring the classification documents I requested? Reed turned, momentarily confused. Classification documents? For the German designs, Reynolds continued smoothly. When we spoke last week about incorporating them into the project, you said you'd handle the official clearance paperwork so we could proceed without bureaucratic delays. Sullivan hid his surprise as he realized what Reynolds was doing. The old engineer was creating a plausible scenario where military intelligence had already been informed and had approved the use of the German designs. Reed hesitated, clearly caught off guard. I don't recall any such conversation, Mr. Reynolds. No. Reynolds looked genuinely puzzled. Must have been someone else from your department then. You fellows all look alike to these old eyes. Regardless, we're proceeding as authorized, unless you have paperwork indicating otherwise. It was a masterful maneuver. Reynolds had shifted the burden of proof onto Reed, who now would need to document why the design should be removed from the project, rather than Sullivan having to justify their retention. I'll need to consult with my superiors, Reed said finally. In the meantime, I'm assigning 2 of my men to this facility as security liaisons, standard procedure for classified projects. Sullivan recognized the compromise for what it was. Reed was backing down on the immediate confiscation of the designs, but establishing a presence that would allow ongoing monitoring of the project. Of course, Sullivan agreed. We welcome the additional security. This is sensitive work. After Reed departed to instruct his men, Sullivan turned to Reynolds with newfound appreciation. "That was impressive, Sam. I didn't know you had a talent for creative diplomacy." Reynolds chuckled. "You don't live as long as I have in government service without learning how to navigate bureaucracy, Thomas. Besides, I recognized Reed's type immediately. He's not here for security reasons. He's gathering information for someone with an agenda." "But who?" Sullivan wondered aloud. "And why target our project so early before we've even produced results?" "Because someone sees the potential and fears it," Reynolds said simply. "Tanks represent a fundamental shift in warfare, just as the machine gun did in my day. Such shifts threaten established powers, doctrines, and budgets." Sullivan nodded slowly, the political dimensions of their technical work becoming clearer. "So we have supporters like Congressman Mitchell and opponents like whoever sent Reed. And we're caught in the middle, trying to build something worthwhile while the politicians and generals play their games." Reynolds placed a hand on Sullivan's shoulder. "Welcome to weapons development, my boy. The enemy isn't just technical challenges, it's human nature itself." As they rejoined the team, Sullivan noticed Reed's men taking up positions near the entrance, their attentive posture suggesting they were more than simple security guards. Watching them, Sullivan was reminded of forward observers he had seen during the war, men who directed artillery fire from advanced positions. The question was, what kind of bombardment were these observers preparing for, and when would it begin? The answer came sooner than Sullivan expected. That evening, as the team was preparing to depart after a productive day, one of Reed's men approached with a sealed envelope. "Instructions from Colonel Reed, sir," the man said, handing the envelope to Sullivan. "Effective immediately." Inside was an official order restricting access to certain materials and equipment, ostensibly for security reasons. The list included precisely the items most critical for their work: the testing dynamometer, the metallurgical analysis equipment, and the precision machine tools promised by Congressman Mitchell. Sullivan read the order twice, noting the official War Department letterhead and the signatures of not just Reed, but also a general he recognized as one of the Army's most vocal critics of mechanized warfare. "Clever," Sullivan muttered. "They can't shut us down directly, so they'll strangle us with security protocols." He looked up to find Charlie watching him, concern evident in his son's expression. "Bad news?" Charlie asked. Sullivan handed him the order. "First salvo in what I suspect will be an ongoing battle, but not with guns and shells. This is bureaucratic warfare." Charlie scanned the document, his West Point training allowing him to quickly grasp its implications. "This effectively halts our progress. Without those tools, we can't validate any designs or produce testable components." "Exactly," Sullivan agreed. "And I'd bet my pension that if we complain through official channels, we'll be met with endless delays and redirections. By the time we get a resolution, our funding window will have closed." Sullivan gathered the core team in his office, sharing the order and its implications. Their reactions ranged from O'Malley's profane outbursts to Eleanor's cool analytical assessment of alternatives to Dr. Freeman's resigned acceptance of yet another institutional obstacle. "So what do we do?" Eleanor asked the question they were all thinking. "Proceed with theoretical work until the restrictions are lifted?" Sullivan shook his head. "Theory won't impress Congressman Mitchell or secure our continued funding. We need tangible results." He turned to Reynolds. "Sam, you've been through this before. Any suggestions?" The old engineer had been quiet, studying the order with narrowed eyes. "This is signed by General Hartwell." "Arthur Hartwell?" "Yes," Sullivan confirmed. "Do you know him?" Reynolds smiled thinly. "Know him? I saved his life at San Juan Hill in '98. He was a young captain then, charging up that hill with more courage than sense. Took a Spanish bullet in the shoulder that would have bled him dry if I hadn't been there with my field kit." The team exchanged glances, seeing a glimmer of hope. "Can you use that connection?" Sullivan asked. "Perhaps," Reynolds said cautiously. "But it would mean a trip to Washington, and there's no guarantee Hartwell remembers an old engineer who patched him up nearly 20 years ago." "It's worth trying," Sullivan decided. "In the meantime, we need a way to work around these restrictions." Dr. Freeman cleared his throat. "I might have a solution for the metallurgical analysis. Howard University's chemistry department has equipment that, while not cutting edge, would serve our basic needs. As a former faculty member, I could arrange access." O'Malley nodded enthusiastically. "And I know guys at Packard who could machine some components off the books, not the precision parts, but enough to keep us moving forward." "I can handle the dynamometer issue," Eleanor added. "MIT maintains several in their engineering department. My former professor would allow us to use them if I explained the circumstances. Sullivan felt a surge of pride in his team's resourcefulness. Good, we'll establish these alternative channels while Sam attempts to resolve the official blockade. We proceed on parallel tracks, comply with the restrictions officially while finding workarounds unofficially. Charlie, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up. There's another approach we could take. All eyes turned to him. Military intelligence isn't the only branch with interest in advanced technology. The Army Air Service has its own development programs with separate funding and oversight. Sullivan immediately saw where his son was heading. And as our liaison to the Air Service, you could potentially secure access to their facilities and equipment. Charlie nodded. Exactly. Many of the tools we need for tank engine development are identical to those used in aircraft engine research. I could frame it as a collaborative effort beneficial to both branches. The strategy was taking shape, a multi-pronged approach that would allow them to continue their work despite the obstacles being placed in their path. As the team dispersed to implement their assigned tasks, Sullivan felt a renewed determination. The bureaucratic warfare had begun, but they would not be defeated by paperwork and politics. Later that evening, alone in his modest apartment near the facility, Sullivan carefully removed Weber's designs from their hiding place. He had taken the precaution of secreting them away from the factory after Reed's visit, anticipating that the intelligence officer might return with a search order. Spreading the drawings on his small dining table, Sullivan studied them once more, seeing details he had missed in earlier examinations. Weber had been a visionary, anticipating problems that had only become apparent to Allied designers in the final months of the war. As Sullivan traced the elegant solutions with his finger, his mind returned to the German officer, wondering again if he had survived his wounds. There was something deeply personal about these designs, as if Weber had poured not just his engineering knowledge, but his very soul into them. Sullivan had experienced a similar connection with his own work at Ford, where each improvement to the assembly line had felt like an extension of himself. During the war, that sense of creation had been replaced by destruction. The engineer's mind forced to calculate angles of fire and thickness of armor in terms of lives lost rather than efficiency gained. Now, with Project Freedom Forge, Sullivan had a chance to return to creation, to build something that might ultimately save lives rather than end them. The irony that this creative act involved designing a weapon of war wasn't lost on him, but he had seen firsthand how superior technology could shorten conflicts and reduce casualties. A knock at his door interrupted these reflections. Sullivan quickly gathered Weber's designs, concealing them before answering. To his surprise, Charlie stood in the hallway, still in his uniform, but with an uncharacteristic hesitancy in his posture. "May I come in?" Charlie asked formally. Sullivan stepped aside, gesturing his son inside. The apartment was sparsely furnished, reflecting Sullivan's recent divorce and his focus on work rather than domestic comfort. Charlie glanced around, taking in the engineering books stacked on every surface and the absence of personal touches. "You're living like a cadet," Charlie observed, the faintest hint of a smile softening his serious expression. "Easier this way," Sullivan replied. "Never was much for decorating, even before your mother handled that side of things." The mention of Charlie's mother created a momentary tension. The divorce had been difficult for all involved, with Sullivan's war experiences and subsequent withdrawal creating a gulf that neither spouse could bridge. Charlie had been caught in the middle, his loyalty divided between parents he loved but no longer recognized. "I've been thinking about what you said earlier," Charlie began, pacing the small living room, "about the next war and giving our side the advantage. I believe in that mission, but I need to know something." Sullivan waited, sensing the importance of whatever question was coming. Charlie stopped pacing and faced his father directly. "Those German designs, did you obtain them legitimately? Were they freely given, or did you—" He trailed off, unable to voice the implicit accusation. Sullivan understood immediately. Charlie was asking if his father had stolen the designs, or worse, obtained them through coercion or violence. The question stung, but Sullivan recognized it came from Charlie's deeply ingrained sense of honor, instilled first by Sullivan himself and then reinforced at West Point. "They were given freely," Sullivan said firmly. "The German officer, Weber was his name, was dying or believed he was. He wanted his work to survive, to matter. Engineer to engineer, he entrusted them to me. I didn't steal them, Charlie. I accepted a legacy." Charlie studied his father's face, searching for any sign of deception. Finally, he nodded. "I needed to hear that, because what we're doing now, Finding workarounds to official restrictions, skating the edges of protocol, it's necessary, but it borders on insubordination. I needed to know we're doing it for the right reasons. Sullivan was struck by his son's maturity and his moral clarity. At 23, Charlie possessed an ethical framework that Sullivan himself had only developed through years of difficult experiences and painful compromises. The right reasons, Sullivan echoed. Sometimes those are clearer in war than in peace. In combat, the moral calculus is often simplified to survival. Yours, your men's, your nation's. It's after the shooting stops that things become complicated. Charlie sat down across from Sullivan, leaning forward intently. I've never asked about what happened over there, what you experienced. Mother said not to, that men don't like to talk about such things. Sullivan felt the familiar constriction in his chest, the tightening that preceded the nightmares and the flashbacks. For months after returning, he had refused to discuss the war, bottling everything inside until the pressure nearly broke him. The army doctors had suggested talking might help, but the only people who truly understood were those who had been there, and Sullivan had avoided his fellow veterans, each a mirror reflecting his own trauma. But Charlie wasn't asking out of morbid curiosity or abstract interest. He was asking as a son, trying to understand his father, and as a military officer trying to comprehend the reality behind the theories he had studied. It was, Sullivan began, then paused, searching for words that could convey the inexplicable. It was hell, but not the fire and brimstone kind preachers talk about. It was a muddy, mechanical hell, where men died not in glorious charges, but huddled in trenches or trapped in disabled tanks. Once started, the words flowed more easily, a dam finally breaching after holding back too much for too long. Sullivan spoke of the noise that never ceased, the constant fear that became as much a part of existence as breathing, the moments of unexpected beauty amid horror, and the bonds formed with men who understood that each day might be their last. He spoke of tank warfare specifically, the claustrophobic terror of being sealed in a metal box under fire, the mechanical problems that turned protective armor into death traps, and the design flaws that cost lives. Flaws he had sworn to correct if he survived. Throughout, Charlie listened without interruption, his expression transitioning from professional interest to deep empathy. When Sullivan finally fell silent, emotionally exhausted but somehow lighter, Charlie reached across the table and gripped his father's hand. Now I understand, Charlie said simply, why this project means so much to you. It's not just engineering or patriotism, it's redemption. Sullivan hadn't thought of it in those terms, but his son's insight struck a chord of truth. Every improvement they made to tank design was, in some small way, atonement for the men who had died under his command in flawed machines. Perhaps it is, Sullivan acknowledged, but whatever my personal reasons, the work matters. And now, with Reed and his superiors trying to sabotage us, it matters even more that we succeed despite them. Charlie nodded, his resolution visibly strengthened. I'll contact my air service connections first thing tomorrow. We'll find a way forward, Father, together. As Charlie left, Sullivan felt a shifting in the foundation of their relationship. The formal distance that had characterized their interactions since his return from war had begun to close, replaced by something new. Mutual respect between men, not just father and son. The night's conversation had revealed something else as well, something Sullivan had been too close to see clearly. Project Freedom Forge wasn't just about building a better tank or securing America's military future. For Sullivan, and perhaps for each member of his eclectic team, it represented something deeply personal, a chance for redemption, for purpose, for proving that creation could triumph over destruction. With renewed determination, Sullivan returned to Weber's designs, seeing in them not just technical innovations, but a bridge between enemies, a recognition that beneath the uniforms and national allegiances, engineers shared a common language and a common goal: to solve problems and build better futures. In that moment, Sullivan made a silent promise to the German officer who had entrusted him with these designs. Whether Weber had survived or not, his legacy would live on, transformed and improved by American ingenuity, but honoring the original vision. The battle ahead would be fought not on muddy European fields, but in American workshops in Washington offices. The enemies would be bureaucracy and narrow thinking rather than machine guns and artillery. But the stakes were just as high, and Sullivan was just as determined to emerge victorious. Outside, a light snow began to fall on Baltimore, covering the muddy grounds of the factory in a clean white blanket that hinted at new beginnings and fresh possibilities. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, for the first time since returning from war, Thomas Sullivan slept without nightmares. Spring arrived in Baltimore with an explosion of cherry blossoms and renewed purpose at the converted factory housing Project Freedom Forge. 3 months had passed since Colonel Thomas Sullivan assembled his unlikely crew of innovators, and despite obstacles placed in their path, the cavernous floor now showcased their progress. A full-scale wooden mock-up of what would become the Liberty tank. Sullivan stood before it, his experienced eyes assessing every angle and dimension. Though his legs still pained him in cold weather, he gradually discarded his cane, refusing to show weakness. Beside him stood Sam Reynolds, the Civil War veteran whose engineering wisdom had proven invaluable. "What do you think, Sam?" Sullivan asked, gesturing to the mock-up. Reynolds circled the wooden structure, his gnarled hands occasionally touching a surface or measuring a gap with fingers that had spent decades calculating tolerances. Despite his 75 years, the old engineer's mind remained razor-sharp. "The overall configuration is sound," Reynolds concluded. "Better than the Renault, certainly. More spacious fighting compartment, better visibility for the commander." He tapped the turret ring. "But this is still problematic. The bearing assembly needs to be more robust if it's going to support a larger turret with heavier armament." Their discussion was interrupted by Eleanor Wright, her auburn hair now tied back with a practical bandana. Months of hands-on work had transformed the academic engineer into a pragmatic problem solver who wasn't afraid to get her hands dirty. "Colonel," she called, excitement evident in her voice, "the armor samples are back from Howard University. Dr. Freeman says you'll want to see the results immediately." In the makeshift laboratory, Dr. Marcus Freeman stood before a table covered with metal plates of varying thickness, each showing the impact of ballistic testing. Despite the continuous slights and obstacles he faced as a black scientist in 1919 America, Freeman had maintained both his dignity and scientific rigor. He lifted one of the metal plates, approximately half an inch thick with a distinct angular face. The plate showed a deep indentation where a projectile had struck it, but crucially, no penetration. "This is our new composite armor with the deflection geometry Miss Wright proposed," Freeman explained. "We tested it against standard German armor-piercing rounds at 100 yards. The angled surface caused significant deflection, while the layered composition absorbed the remaining energy." "How does it compare to equivalent thickness of standard armor?" Sullivan asked, examining the impact site. 23% more effective at stopping penetration," Freeman stated with justified pride, "and 17% lighter." Sullivan nodded, already calculating how this development would affect their overall design parameters. "What about production feasibility? Can this be manufactured at scale?" Eleanor stepped forward. "That's the best part. I've been consulting with Pittsburgh steel manufacturers. The process is more complex than standard armor production, but entirely achievable with existing equipment. It would increase unit cost by approximately 12%, but the weight savings and increased protection more than justify the expense." As Sullivan was about to respond, Charlie entered the facility, his air service uniform crisp despite the early hour. Over the past months, his son had proven invaluable, securing access to testing facilities through his military connections and contributing practical insights from his pilot's perspective. "Any word from Washington?" Sullivan asked as Charlie approached. Charlie shook his head. "Nothing official, but I heard rumors at the Officers Club last night. The Cavalry Association is lobbying hard against any expansion of mechanized warfare programs. They're arguing that the terrain in any future American conflict would be unsuitable for tanks." Sullivan frowned. "They're fighting the last war, not the next one. If they'd seen what I saw in France." "There's something else," Charlie added, lowering his voice. "Lieutenant Colonel Reed was there, meeting with several senior officers. They seemed very interested in his report on our progress." Sullivan's frown deepened. Reed's security liaison officers maintained a constant presence at the facility, observing and reporting back to their superior. Despite their attempts to appear merely protective, it was clear they were monitoring every aspect of the project, looking for any excuse to shut it down. As Charlie headed toward the drafting area, Sullivan was struck by a sharp, stabbing pain in his left side, radiating from war wounds that had never fully healed. He grimaced, instinctively reaching for the small pill box in his pocket. The morphine tablets prescribed by Army doctors had become a daily necessity, managing pain that would otherwise leave him incapacitated. He had been careful to hide his dependence from the team, taking the tablets privately and maintaining strict control over the dosage. But lately, he'd found himself increasing the frequency as the pain worsened under the stress of the project. Finding a moment of privacy in his office, Sullivan swallowed a tablet dry, waiting for the familiar sensation of relief to spread through his body. As the pain receded, he pulled out Weber's original designs from their hiding place in a hollowed-out technical manual, finding new insights that informed their progress. A knock at the door forced Sullivan to quickly conceal the designs before Jack O'Malley stepped in, his perpetually rumpled appearance belying the precision of his engineering mind. The engine specialist had proven his worth many times over, though his brilliance came with complications. His drinking had worsened in recent months, with several Monday mornings finding him red-eyed and trembling. Sullivan had addressed it privately once, only to learn that O'Malley had lost his young son to the Spanish flu, a wound that refused to heal. "Got a minute, Colonel?" O'Malley asked, spreading blueprints on Sullivan's desk. "I've been working on adapting the Liberty aircraft engine for our needs, and we've hit a problem." Sullivan studied the drawings, immediately seeing the issue. The cooling system. It's designed for airflow at altitude, not the confined space of a tank hull. O'Malley nodded vigorously. "Exactly. In an aircraft, you've got constant air movement cooling the cylinders. In a tank, we're essentially putting a high-performance engine in a hot box. Early calculations suggest potential overheating after just 30 minutes of operation. What solutions are you considering?" "Three approaches. First, a more robust liquid cooling system with larger radiators. Second, modification of the cylinder head design to improve heat dissipation. Third, a completely redesigned airflow system that channels external air more efficiently." "And your recommendation?" "A combination of all three," O'Malley said without hesitation. "But it will require significant redesign work and delay the prototype by at least 6 weeks." Sullivan nodded, understanding the implications. "Start with the redesigned cooling system. I'll inform Congressman Mitchell of the delay. Better to deliver a working prototype late than a failing one on schedule." After O'Malley left, Sullivan sat heavily in his chair, feeling the weight of the project's mounting challenges. The technical obstacles were expected, but the political and bureaucratic resistance had proven even more formidable. A light tap announced Eleanor Wright's return, her expression concerned. "What's wrong?" Sullivan asked, straightening in his chair. "It's Dr. Freeman," Eleanor said, her voice tight with controlled anger. "The guards refused to let him enter this morning. They claimed his security clearance requires additional verification and took his access badge." Sullivan moved past her, his face set in a hard expression that those who served under him in France would have recognized as dangerous. Eleanor followed as he strode through the facility toward the main entrance, where Reed's men maintained their security checkpoint. The two guards straightened as Sullivan approached. Both were young men with the overly serious expressions of those trying to appear more authoritative than their experience justified. "Where is Dr. Freeman?" Sullivan demanded without preamble. The senior guard, a corporal named Donovan, responded with practiced neutrality. "Sir, we were instructed to hold his credentials for review. Standard security protocol for all technical personnel." "Dr. Freeman has had clearance since this project began," Sullivan stated. "Nothing has changed to warrant a review." Corporal Donovan's expression remained impassive. "I'm following orders, sir. Lieutenant Colonel Reed specifically instructed us to verify Dr. Freeman's background again due to concerns." "What concerns?" Eleanor interjected, unable to contain her indignation. The corporal hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. "I'm not at liberty to discuss the specific security concerns, ma'am." Sullivan leaned closer, lowering his voice. "Let me be perfectly clear, Corporal. Dr. Freeman is an essential member of this team, with expertise we cannot function without. Whatever concerns Lieutenant Colonel Reed has invented, they do not supersede my authority as project director. You will return Dr. Freeman's credentials immediately and allow him access to this facility, or I will personally call General Pershing to discuss this obstruction of a classified military project." The mention of Pershing's name had the desired effect. The guards exchanged glances, weighing the immediate authority of Reed against the potential intervention of America's most senior military commander. "We'll need to document this override, sir," Corporal Donovan said finally. "For the record." "Document whatever you need to," Sullivan replied. "Just get Dr. Freeman in here now." 10 minutes later, Dr. Freeman was at his workstation, outwardly composed but with tension in his shoulders that spoke of the humiliation he had endured. Sullivan approached him privately. I apologize for what happened, Marcus, Sullivan said. It was unacceptable and won't happen again. Freeman adjusted his spectacles, focusing on the paperwork before him. We both know this isn't the first time, Colonel, nor will it be the last. I've faced similar treatment my entire career. That doesn't make it right, Sullivan insisted. Your work is vital to this project. Freeman finally looked up, his expression a careful mask of professional detachment. Is it my work that you value, Colonel, or me as a person? Because too often in my experience, white America is happy to benefit from black achievement while keeping the achievers at arm's length. The question struck Sullivan with uncomfortable force. Had he truly considered the additional burdens someone like Freeman faced daily? The constant slights, the need to be twice as good to be considered half as worthy? Both, Sullivan answered honestly. Your expertise is irreplaceable, but so is your perspective. This project needs you, not just your knowledge. Freeman studied him for a long moment, then gave a small nod. Then help me do my job without interference from men like Reed who see my skin before my credentials. I will, Sullivan promised. And I'd like to hear more about your experiences, if you're willing to share them. I can't change what I don't understand. A hint of surprise crossed Freeman's face, quickly replaced by cautious appreciation. Perhaps over lunch sometime, Colonel, but for now we have work to do. Sullivan's contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Sam Reynolds, his face grave. We have a problem, Thomas, Reynolds said without preamble, using Sullivan's first name as he only did in moments of serious concern. The metallurgical samples we sent to Pittsburgh for analysis were intercepted. Someone is claiming they represent an unauthorized transfer of classified military technology. Sullivan cursed under his breath. Reed again? Possibly, though this came through official War Department channels, not directly from him. Reynolds handed over a telegram. They're demanding all research be turned over to the Ordnance Department for proper evaluation and development. Sullivan read the telegram, recognizing bureaucratic language that disguised an attempted appropriation of their work. This isn't about security. They're trying to take control of the project. Exactly, Reynolds agreed. And if they succeed, Freedom Forge will become just another folder gathering dust, while the old guard continues funding cavalry and traditional artillery. We need to speak with Congressman Mitchell. He's our best defense against this kind of interference. Already sent a telegram, Reynolds confirmed. But there's something else you should know. Jack O'Malley didn't come in today. Charlie went to check his apartment and found him indisposed. Apparently, he's been on a drinking binge since yesterday afternoon. Sullivan closed his eyes briefly, another complication in an already challenging situation. How bad? Bad enough that Charlie couldn't rouse him. Reynolds' weathered face showed genuine concern. This isn't the first time, Thomas. The boy's drinking has been getting worse. Sullivan knew Reynolds was right. O'Malley's brilliance came with the devastating counterweight of his personal demons. The loss of his son had hollowed him out, leaving alcohol to fill the void. Sullivan recognized the pattern too well. It wasn't so different from his own increasing reliance on morphine to manage not just physical pain, but psychological burdens from the war. I'll speak with him tomorrow, Sullivan decided. For now, we'll have to continue without him. Eleanor can take over the cooling system redesign. She's been working closely with Jack on it. Reynolds nodded, though his expression suggested he had more to say. After a moment of hesitation, he spoke again, his voice gentler. Thomas, the team needs steady leadership now more than ever. They need you at your best. Sullivan understood the unspoken concern. Though he'd tried to hide his dependence on morphine, little escaped Reynolds' observant eyes. I'm fine, Sam, just tired. The following morning, Sullivan arrived to find Charlie waiting for him, tension evident in his posture. What's happened? Sullivan asked, immediately alert. Two things, Boris, Charlie replied, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. First, O'Malley is still absent. I checked on him again this morning, and he's in no condition to work. He needs help, Father, more than we can provide. Sullivan nodded grimly. And the second thing? A visitor arrived about 20 minutes ago. He's waiting in your office. Charlie's expression was unreadable. Says his name is Klaus Weber. Sullivan felt as if the floor had suddenly tilted beneath him. Klaus Weber, the German officer who had given him the tank designs in the Argonne Forest. The man he'd believed might be dead, whose legacy he'd carried forward into this project. Weber is alive? Sullivan managed, his mind racing through implications. Charlie nodded. Very much so. And he seems to know a great deal about our project, though he wouldn't tell me how. Sullivan moved quickly toward his office, his heart pounding with a mixture of curiosity, apprehension, and a strange sense of completion, as if a circle begun in the chaos of battle was finally closing. The man who stood as Sullivan entered was both familiar and transformed from their brief encounter in France. Klaus Weber had recovered from his wounds, though a certain pallor suggested he hadn't regained full health. His military bearing remained, but he now wore a civilian suit of modest quality, and his formerly close-cropped hair had grown longer, softening his appearance. "Colonel Sullivan," Weber said in accented but fluent English, extending his hand. "It is good to see you again, under better circumstances." Sullivan shook the offered hand, studying the German's face. "I wasn't sure you'd survived." A slight smile crossed Weber's features. "Thanks to American medical care, I did, though I spent 8 months in a prisoner of war camp before being repatriated to Germany." His expression sobered. "But I returned to a country in chaos, a defeated army, and an engineering corps being dismantled by the Treaty of Versailles." Sullivan gestured for Weber to sit, taking his own chair. "How did you find me? How did you even get into the United States?" "Finding you was not difficult. Your name appeared in military records of the engagement where we met. As for entering America," Weber shrugged, "I have relatives in Pennsylvania who sponsored my immigration. With Germany and economic collapse, many of us are seeking opportunities elsewhere." Sullivan considered this, noting how Weber had smoothly avoided specifics about how he'd tracked Sullivan to the Freedom Forge project. "And what brings you here specifically, Herr Weber?" "I doubt it's coincidence." Weber's expression became more serious. "No, not coincidence. I came because I heard rumors of an American tank development program, and I suspected my designs might have found their way into it." He leaned forward slightly. "Those designs represented my life's work, Colonel. I gave them to you when I believed death was imminent, entrusting them to a fellow engineer rather than letting them be lost. But now that I have survived," the implication hung in the air. Weber had come to reclaim ownership of his intellectual contribution, or at least recognition for it. "Your designs have been invaluable," Sullivan acknowledged. "They formed the foundation of our initial work, though we've made significant modifications and improvements." Weber nodded, seemingly pleased by this admission. "I would expect nothing less from American engineering ingenuity. I haven't come to demand their return or halt your progress. Rather, I've come to offer my services." Sullivan's surprise must have shown because Weber continued quickly. "I am an engineer without a country to serve, Colonel. Germany's military development is severely restricted by the treaty. My expertise is unwelcome there, but could be valuable here." The offer was both tempting and concerning. Weber's knowledge would undoubtedly accelerate their progress, especially with O'Malley's absence. But bringing a former enemy officer into a classified military project would create complications with Reed and his superiors. "Your expertise would indeed be valuable," Sullivan said carefully, "but your background presents obvious security concerns." Weber smiled thinly. "Of course, I understand the political sensitivities. Perhaps we could begin with a consulting arrangement, unofficial until the proper clearances can be arranged." Before Sullivan could respond, the door opened without a knock, revealing Lieutenant Colonel Reed with 2 armed military police officers behind him. Reed's expression was coldly triumphant as he surveyed the scene. "Colonel Sullivan," Reed said formally, "you are hereby ordered to surrender all project documentation to these officers. Project Freedom Forge has been suspended pending a full security investigation." Sullivan stood slowly, maintaining his composure despite the shock. "On what grounds?" Reed gestured toward Weber. "Unauthorized contact with foreign nationals, suspected espionage, mishandling of classified information." His smile was without warmth. "Take your pick, Sullivan. The orders are signed by General Hartwell himself." Sullivan glanced at Weber, whose expression had turned carefully neutral. "This man is a civilian engineering consultant who approached our project through proper channels. Nothing classified has been discussed." "Save your explanations for the inquiry board," Reed replied dismissively. He turned to the MPs. "Secure all documentation in this office and throughout the facility. No one leaves until everything has been cataloged and removed." As the MPs moved to comply, Sullivan stepped closer to Reed, lowering his voice. "This is about more than security protocols. Who's really behind this, Reed? Who stands to benefit from shutting us down?" A flicker of something, perhaps respect, perhaps caution, crossed Reed's face. "You're playing a game you don't understand, Sullivan. There are powerful interests invested in maintaining the military status quo. Your little project threatens budget allocations, strategic doctrine, and industrial contracts worth millions. So it's about money, Sullivan concluded, not national security. Reed shrugged. It's always about money, Colonel. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be for everyone. The facility was thrown into chaos as Reed's men began systematically collecting all project documentation. Team members were confined to a common area while their workstations were searched and their research confiscated. Eleanor Wright approached Sullivan, her composure remarkable given the circumstances. What's happening? Are they shutting us down? Temporarily, at least, Sullivan confirmed. Reed is using Weber's appearance as justification for a security clampdown. Eleanor's eyes narrowed. That's just a pretext. They've been looking for an excuse for months. As Sullivan moved to find a telephone, Charlie intercepted him, his expression a mixture of concern and barely suppressed anger. Father, there's something you should know about Weber. When the MPs arrived, I saw him exchange a look with one of them, like they recognized each other. Sullivan frowned. You think Weber is working with Reed? I don't know, Charlie admitted, but his timing is too convenient. He shows up just as we're making real progress, and immediately afterward, Reed has the justification he needs to shut us down. Sullivan considered this, his tactical mind assessing the possibility that Weber's appearance had been orchestrated specifically to create a pretext for Reed's intervention. It seemed far-fetched, yet the timing was indeed suspicious. Keep an eye on him, Sullivan instructed. Don't confront him, just observe. I need to make some calls before they completely lock us down. By mid-afternoon, the facility had been effectively stripped of all technical documentation. The team members were released after signing confidentiality agreements, reinforcing their obligation not to discuss the project. Weber had been taken separately for extended questioning, his face betraying no emotion as he was escorted out. Sullivan was the last to leave, standing in the now empty main floor where their wooden mock-up had been dismantled and removed. Sam Reynolds joined him, the old engineer's face lined with fatigue and disappointment. I've seen this before, Reynolds said quietly. After the Civil War, when bureaucrats and politicians decided which technologies would advance and which would be forgotten. It's never about the merit of the ideas. It's about who benefits from them. Sullivan nodded, feeling the weight of failure pressing down on him. I underestimated our opponents. I thought the technical success of the project would speak for itself. It would have, Reynolds assured him. That's why they moved when they did. They saw we were making progress and knew they had to act before we had something tangible to demonstrate. Sullivan turned to his mentor, determination replacing momentary despair. This isn't over, Sam. Reed and his backers have won this battle, but not the war. Reynolds smiled slightly at the military metaphor. What's your next move, Colonel? First, we check on O'Malley. Get him the help he needs. Sullivan began walking toward the exit, Reynolds falling in step beside him. Then we gather the team somewhere private, away from Reed's surveillance. They've taken our documentation, but they can't take our knowledge or our resolve. That evening, Sullivan sat alone in his apartment, the pain in his side flaring worse than usual after the stress of the day. He reached automatically for his pillbox, then hesitated, Charlie's words from earlier echoing in his mind. His son had noted the frequency with which Sullivan took the morphine, his concern evident, though unspoken. With deliberate effort, Sullivan returned the pillbox to his pocket unopened. The pain would have to be managed through other means. He needed clarity of thought to plan their next steps. A knock at his door interrupted his contemplation. Sullivan approached with his service pistol in hand. Who is it? Eleanor Wright, came the reply. I'm alone. Sullivan opened the door to find not just Eleanor, but the entire core team. Reynolds, Freeman, Charlie, and to his surprise, a haggard but sober O'Malley. They filed in silently, their expressions a mixture of determination and uncertainty. We thought you might be planning something, Eleanor explained, and we wanted you to know that we're still committed to the project, regardless of Reed's actions. Sullivan was momentarily speechless, touched by their solidarity. O'Malley looked especially rough, his eyes bloodshot but clear of the alcoholic haze that had claimed him recently. Jack, Sullivan acknowledged, good to see you on your feet. O'Malley nodded awkwardly. Charlie came by again, made me understand what was happening. I'm sorry I wasn't there when Reed moved against us. You're here now, Sullivan said simply. That's what matters. The team gathered in Sullivan's small living room, perching on whatever furniture was available or standing against walls. Sullivan looked at each face, reading the same resolve he felt himself. Reed believes he's shut us down, Sullivan began. But all he's really done is drive us underground. The question is, how do we proceed without official support or facilities? Dr. Freeman spoke up first. Howard University might provide laboratory space. It wouldn't have all the equipment we need, but it would give us somewhere to continue our materials research. I still have contacts at Packard, O'Malley added. They might let us use their testing facilities after hours, off the books. Eleanor nodded. And MIT would likely support academic research into theoretical armor configurations, especially if presented as purely educational. Charlie had been quiet, but now he straightened from his position against the wall. The Air Service testing grounds at Langley Field could be useful as well. I've been cross-training there, and security is more focused on aircraft than ground vehicles. Sullivan was impressed by their resourcefulness, but Reynolds voiced the concern they all shared. These alternatives might allow us to continue research, but without significant funding, we can't actually build anything. That's where I come in, said a new voice from the doorway to Sullivan's kitchen. Everyone turned in surprise to see Congressman Howard Mitchell standing there, having apparently entered through the apartment's back door. His expensive suit was slightly rumpled, and he carried a leather briefcase that he placed on Sullivan's dining table. Congressman, Sullivan recovered quickly. I didn't expect a house call. Mitchell smiled grimly. These are unusual circumstances. When my aide informed me of what happened today, I knew Reed and his backers would be monitoring all official channels of communication. Sometimes direct action is required. How did you get in? Charlie asked, his military training making him security conscious. Your father's apartment has a fire escape that connects to the alley behind the building, Mitchell replied casually. An observant man might use such a route to avoid being seen by the men watching the front entrance. Mitchell opened his briefcase, revealing stacks of documents and a significant amount of cash. The official project may be suspended, but there are other ways to finance important work. Private investors who understand the potential of armored warfare and are willing to back its development, quietly, for now. Private investors, Sullivan repeated, skeptical. Who exactly are we talking about? Mitchell spread his hands. Industrialists with foresight, men who recognize that America's military future will require advanced technology. Men who stand to profit, certainly, but whose interests align with national security. Reynolds crossed his arms, equally dubious. And what do these investors expect in return? Results, Mitchell said simply. And eventually, government contracts when the value of your work becomes undeniable. In the meantime, they're willing to provide the resources you need to continue development away from Reed's interference. If we accept this private funding, where would we work? Reed has seized the facility and all our equipment. Mitchell smiled. I've arranged access to a property in Virginia about 2 hours from Washington, a former munitions testing site, unused since the war ended, but still equipped with the basic infrastructure you'll need. Remote enough to avoid unwanted attention, but accessible for your team. Sullivan looked around at his team, reading their expressions. They were cautiously optimistic, seeing a path forward where earlier there had seemed to be none. Even Reynolds, typically the most skeptical, seemed to be considering the possibilities. We need time to discuss this, Sullivan said finally. As a team, Mitchell nodded, understanding the need for consensus. Of course, but don't take too long. Reed and his allies believe they've won. The longer you remain inactive, the more confident they'll become. After Mitchell departed, the team gathered around Sullivan's dining table to examine the documents. The financial arrangements were generous, the facility specifications promising, and the operational independence seemed assured, at least on paper. What about Weber? Charlie asked, returning to his earlier concern. If he's released, do we bring him into this new arrangement? It was a crucial question. Weber's expertise would be valuable, but his involvement had already triggered one disaster. Could they risk another? We wait until he's released, Sullivan decided. Observe him, perhaps make indirect contact through intermediaries. If we're convinced he wasn't complicit in Reed's actions, then we consider bringing him aboard, cautiously. As midnight approached, Sullivan called for a decision. We've analyzed this from every angle, he said. Now we need to choose. Do we accept Mitchell's offer and continue our work privately, or do we disperse and wait for official reinstatement that may never come? One by one, the team members voted. Freeman, O'Malley, and Reynolds supported accepting the offer. Eleanor remained hesitant, but ultimately agreed it was their best option. Charlie, after thoughtful consideration, also assented, though with clear reservations about Mitchell's true motives. Then it's decided, Sullivan concluded. We accept the funding and relocate to Virginia, but we proceed with eyes open, aware that Mitchell and his investors have their own agenda. As the team prepared to leave, Charlie remained behind. When they were alone, he turned to his father with undisguised concern. You're in pain, he stated simply. Worse than usual. Sullivan didn't bother denying it. It's manageable. Charlie's expression was skeptical. With increasing doses of morphine, I've noticed, Father. We all have. The directness caught Sullivan off guard. He had believed his dependence well concealed. The doctors prescribed it, Sullivan said defensively, for legitimate pain from war injuries. I know, Charlie acknowledged, but there's prescribed use and then there's dependence. You're walking a dangerous line. Sullivan wanted to dismiss the concern, to assert that he had everything under control, but the genuine worry in his son's eyes stopped him. What would you have me do? The pain doesn't go away just because it's inconvenient. Talk to a doctor, a different one, not the army physicians who hand out morphine to keep veterans quiet. Charlie's voice was firm but compassionate. There are other approaches to pain management, and you need to be at your best for what's coming. The team needs you clear-headed, not dulled by opiates. The truth of Charlie's words cut through Sullivan's defensiveness. He had been increasing his dosage steadily, justifying each increment as necessary rather than acknowledging the growing dependence. I'll look into alternatives, Sullivan conceded. It wasn't a full commitment, but it was a start, an acknowledgement that Charlie's concern was valid. 2 days later, a convoy of unmarked trucks wound its way along rural Virginia roads toward the abandoned munitions testing site. Sullivan rode in the lead vehicle with Reynolds beside him and Charlie at the wheel. Behind them came the rest of the team and equipment they had managed to salvage or acquire through Mitchell's funding. As they crested a hill, the facility came into view. A collection of concrete buildings surrounded by open testing grounds, all enclosed by a rusted but intact perimeter fence. To Sullivan's experienced eye, it represented something precious. Opportunity. Not exactly the Ritz, Reynolds commented dryly. It has everything we need, Sullivan replied. Space, privacy, and distance from Reed's interference. As they approached the main gate, Sullivan noticed a figure waiting for them. As they drew closer, he recognized the distinctive silhouette of Klaus Weber, standing calmly beside a civilian automobile. Charlie noticed as well, his hands tightening on the steering wheel. What's he doing here? How did he even know about this place? Sullivan's mind raced through possibilities, none of them reassuring. Mitchell must have contacted him, though why he wouldn't inform us first. The convoy stopped. Sullivan approached Weber with caution while signaling others to remain in their vehicles. The German engineer looked tired but composed, his posture suggesting he was prepared for potential hostility. Herr Weber, Sullivan greeted him neutrally, you've saved us the trouble of finding you. Weber smiled slightly. Congressman Mitchell suggested I might find you here. He felt my expertise would be valuable to your continuation efforts. Sullivan studied the German's face, looking for any sign of duplicity. The last time we met, it triggered a security crackdown that shut down our entire project. You'll understand if I'm hesitant about a repeat performance. Completely understandable, Weber acknowledged, but I assure you I had no knowledge of Colonel Reed's plans. In fact, I was as much a victim as you were. 3 days of military interrogation was not how I envisioned my welcome to America. Sullivan wasn't entirely convinced. Why did Mitchell contact you before consulting us? He knew we had concerns about your involvement. Weber reached into his jacket, moving slowly to avoid appearing threatening, and withdrew an envelope. Perhaps this will explain. The congressman asked me to deliver it personally. Sullivan opened it to find a handwritten note from Mitchell. The message was brief but clear. Weber had been thoroughly vetted during his interrogation, with Mitchell receiving classified transcripts that confirmed the German had no connection to Reed or his backers. Furthermore, Mitchell believed Weber's expertise was essential to the accelerated timeline they now faced, as competing interests were developing similar technology. Sullivan passed the note to Reynolds, who read it quickly, his expression thoughtful. Could be genuine, Reynolds conceded, or an elaborate setup. Weber spread his hands in a gesture of openness. I understand your suspicion. In your position, I would feel the same. Perhaps a probationary arrangement? I offer my expertise while you maintain whatever security precautions you deem necessary. Sullivan considered the proposal. Weber's knowledge would undoubtedly accelerate their progress, potentially saving months of development time. But the risk remained that he could be a plant designed to monitor and potentially sabotage their work from within. We keep him isolated from sensitive aspects of the project initially, Sullivan decided after conferring with Reynolds. Give him specific technical problems without revealing the overall design. If his contributions prove valuable and his loyalty seems genuine, we can gradually integrate him further. They returned to Weber, who had waited patiently. You can join us, Sullivan informed him, on a provisional basis. You'll work directly with me and report only to me. Your access to the facility and project documentation will be limited until we're satisfied with the arrangement. Weber nodded, accepting the conditions without complaint. Thank you for the opportunity, Colonel. I won't disappoint you. As the convoy proceeded through the gate, Sullivan couldn't help wondering if they had just made a critical mistake or a decision that would ultimately save their project. Only time would tell, and time was the one resource they couldn't afford to waste. The Virginia facility quickly transformed from abandoned testing site to bustling development center. Weber proved his value almost immediately, identifying critical flaws in their cooling system design and proposing elegant solutions based on his experience with German tank prototypes never fielded during the war. His insights into armor configuration and weight distribution were equally valuable, allowing for significant improvements without compromising mobility. 2 weeks into their new operation, Sullivan called the core team together for a progress assessment. They gathered around a large table in the main building where a new set of blueprints had been laid out, incorporating their latest refinements. "We've made remarkable progress," Sullivan began, genuine pride in his voice. "The cooling system issues are resolved thanks to Weber and O'Malley's collaboration. Freeman and Eleanor have finalized the armor composition, with production samples exceeding performance targets. The drivetrain design is complete and ready for fabrication." As the meeting concluded, Sullivan held Weber back. "Your contributions have been valuable," Sullivan acknowledged, "more than I anticipated." Weber inclined his head slightly. "Thank you, Colonel. It's a privilege to work with such talented engineers." Sullivan studied the German, still searching for any hint of ulterior motives. "I'm curious about something. In all your technical suggestions, you've never once advocated for slavish adherence to your original designs. In fact, you've been quick to recognize where American approaches might be superior. That's unusual for an engineer of your caliber." Weber smiled slightly. "Perhaps it comes from learning hard lessons about the price of pride. Germany lost the war partly because we believed our engineering was inherently superior and failed to learn from our enemies. I don't intend to repeat that mistake." It was an insightful answer, suggesting a depth of reflection that impressed Sullivan. "Your status here is being upgraded," he decided. "Full access to project documentation and facilities, though major design changes still require my approval." The following weeks saw rapid progress as components arrived and assembly began. The prototype tank was taking physical form in the center of their workshop. No longer just blueprints and theories, but a tangible machine of American design and manufacture. Sullivan gradually reduced his reliance on morphine, using alternative pain management techniques suggested by Eleanor. The withdrawal wasn't easy. He suffered nights of sweating, tremors, and intensified pain, but he endured them privately, determined not to let his personal struggle impact the project. Charlie remained his staunchest supporter, both professionally and personally. The father-son relationship, so strained upon Charlie's initial assignment to the project, had evolved into something deeper and more meaningful. They were no longer simply father and son, but comrades in a shared mission. As the prototype neared completion, Congressman Mitchell visited to observe their progress, arriving without entourage in an unmarked automobile that spoke to his continued caution regarding security. "Impressive," Mitchell commented as Sullivan led him around the nearly completed tank. "Very impressive indeed. You've accomplished in weeks what the War Department couldn't achieve in years." Sullivan accepted the compliment with a nod. "We've had the right team and the freedom to work without bureaucratic interference." Mitchell smiled. "My support is about to become even more valuable. I've arranged for a demonstration next month for select military officials, those not aligned with Reed and General Hartwell. If the prototype performs as expected, we'll have powerful allies advocating for official adoption." Sullivan frowned slightly. "A demonstration creates security risks. Reed has spies throughout the military establishment." "A calculated risk," Mitchell acknowledged, "but a necessary one. Private development can only take us so far. Eventually, we need military contracts to move into production. This is the bridge to that outcome." Sullivan nodded reluctantly, understanding the political realities. "We'll be ready, but I want a full week of internal testing before the demonstration. I won't showcase a machine that hasn't proven itself under controlled conditions first." The week of internal testing proved both enlightening and challenging. Initial trials revealed issues with track tension that caused excessive wear during turning maneuvers. The turret rotation mechanism bound occasionally under certain load conditions. The engine overheated during extended operation at maximum power. Each problem was addressed methodically, with the entire team working around the clock to implement solutions before the scheduled demonstration. O'Malley refined the cooling system further. Eleanor and Freeman adjusted metallurgical compositions for key components, and Weber contributed invaluable insights based on problems encountered in German designs. The night before the scheduled demonstration, Sullivan found himself alone with the prototype, making final adjustments to the commander's vision devices. The tank had been painted in olive drab, the official color of U.S. Army vehicles, with a simple white star on each side identifying it as an American machine. It looked imposing and purposeful, its angled armor and low profile giving it a predatory appearance that suited its intended purpose. "You're going to save lives tomorrow," Sullivan told the machine softly. "Not take them, save them by showing what American tanks can become." "Talking to machines now," came Reynolds' voice from behind him. The old engineer approached, carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Sullivan. "Though I suppose engineers have always had special relationships with their creations." Sullivan accepted the coffee gratefully. "Just reminding myself why we're doing this. It's easy to get caught up in the technical challenges and political maneuvering and forget the ultimate purpose." Reynolds nodded, understanding completely. "To give our soldiers the best possible tools for survival and victory." He studied the tank with pride. "She's a beauty, Thomas. The best work we've ever done." "Have you considered what success tomorrow might mean for you personally?" Reynolds asked after a moment. Sullivan looked at him questioningly. "For me, if the Liberty is adopted, someone will need to oversee its production and integration into the Army. Someone who understands both the engineering and tactical aspects." Reynolds gave Sullivan a meaningful look. "You could find yourself with a general's star, Thomas." The suggestion caught Sullivan by surprise. He hadn't thought beyond completing the prototype and securing its adoption. The potential personal advancement hadn't factored into his calculations at all. "I'm an engineer, not a career Army officer," Sullivan demurred. "I just want to see this machine protecting American soldiers in the next conflict." The Virginia testing grounds were bathed in early morning sunlight as the Liberty tank's engine roared to life, its distinctive sound echoing across the facility. Sullivan stood before the assembled military officers and officials, his uniform pressed and medals properly arranged for the first time since the project began. Beside him, Congressman Mitchell made introductions while Sullivan surveyed the audience, quickly identifying friends and foes. As Charlie had warned, Lieutenant Colonel Reed was present, standing beside General Hartwell, whose decorated chest and stern expression conveyed his authority and skepticism. Several other general officers were in attendance, along with representatives from the Ordnance Department and the War Department's Budget Office. "Gentlemen," Sullivan began once Mitchell yielded the floor, "what you're about to witness represents the future of American armored warfare. The Liberty tank incorporates the lessons learned during the Great War, while addressing the limitations of existing European designs. It is faster, better protected, more reliable, and crucially, designed for mass production using American manufacturing methods." The demonstration proceeded flawlessly. The Liberty navigated obstacles with ease, climbed steep inclines that would stop existing designs, and demonstrated its superior speed and maneuverability. The final phase showcased its combat capabilities, with Weber operating the 37mm cannon with impressive accuracy, while O'Malley maintained precise control of the tank's movements. When the firing demonstration concluded, Sullivan invited questions from the assembled officials. Reed was the first to speak, attempting to shift the discussion from technical achievements to broader doctrinal debates. Sullivan countered each challenge with confidence born of intimate knowledge of the Liberty's design and capabilities. After the formal session, Reed approached Sullivan directly. "Congratulations on your dog and pony show, Colonel," he said quietly, his smile not reaching his eyes. "But don't celebrate yet. General Hartwell remains unconvinced, and his opinion carries more weight than all these junior officers combined." Before Sullivan could respond, Weber approached, having overheard the exchange. "With respect, Colonel Reed, that perspective cost Germany dearly. Our general staff made the same argument before the war, leading to underinvestment in armored development. By the time we recognized our error, it was too late to recover." Reed's eyes narrowed at the Germans' intervention. "I don't recall asking for the enemy's opinion, Herr Weber." "Former enemy," Weber corrected calmly, "now a colleague in pursuit of technical truth. Politics and personal animosity should not override sound military judgment. As the visitors departed, Sullivan gathered his team for a brief assessment. Their faces showed the mixture of exhaustion and triumph that comes from successfully completing a high-stakes presentation after months of intensive work. "We did it," Sullivan told them simply. "The Liberty performed flawlessly. Whatever happens next in Washington, we've proven what's possible when the right people are given the freedom to innovate." Charlie approached rapidly, his expression concerned. "Father, General Hartwell is asking to speak with you privately. He's waiting by his staff car." Hartwell stood alone beside his vehicle, having apparently dismissed his aides to ensure privacy. As Sullivan approached and saluted, Hartwell returned the gesture with precise formality. "Walk with me, Colonel," Hartwell instructed, moving away from the vehicles. Once they were beyond earshot of others, he spoke bluntly. "That's an impressive machine you've built. Better than I expected." "Thank you, sir," Sullivan replied, surprised by the admission. "Don't misunderstand me," Hartwell continued. "I still have reservations about the role of tanks in modern warfare. The Army's core will always be its infantry, but your Liberty demonstrates potential I hadn't fully appreciated." Hartwell studied Sullivan carefully. "I'm going to be direct with you. There are powerful interests aligned against your project, not all of them within the military. Defense contractors with substantial investments in traditional weaponry see tanks as a threat to their established business models. This confirms Sullivan's suspicions about the source of Reed's backing. And you, General, where do you stand?" "I stand with the United States Army and its future effectiveness. Politics and personal advancement don't interest me." He turned to face Sullivan directly. "Your demonstration today was persuasive. I'm not prepared to advocate for the Liberty's immediate adoption, but I am recommending continued development in more extensive field trials." It wasn't the unqualified victory Sullivan had hoped for, but it represented a significant shift from Hartwell's previous opposition. "Thank you, sir. That's all we've asked for, a fair evaluation based on performance rather than preconceptions." Hartwell nodded curtly. "Don't thank me yet, Colonel. Reed and his backers won't surrender easily. They'll find new angles of attack, new vulnerabilities." He glanced meaningfully toward where Weber stood with the rest of the team. "Be careful about who you trust." As Sullivan rejoined his team, he found them in high spirits, celebrating the Liberty's performance and the positive reactions from many of the visitors. Looking at Weber, Sullivan recalled Hartwell's warning. Was the German truly as committed to their success as he appeared? Or was there another agenda at work? "Everything all right, Father?" Charlie asked, noticing Sullivan's thoughtful expression. Sullivan nodded, not wanting to dampen the team's well-deserved celebration with his concerns. "Just tired. It's been a long day." As the sun began to set over the Virginia facility, casting long shadows across the testing grounds, Sullivan allowed himself a moment of pride in what they had accomplished. The Liberty tank stood as tangible proof of what American innovation could achieve when freed from bureaucratic constraints and empowered by diverse expertise. Whether that innovation would ultimately transform the U.S. Army or be relegated to an experimental footnote in military history remained to be seen. But Sullivan had done what he set out to do: create a tank worthy of American soldiers, a machine that could protect lives while advancing military capability. For now, that achievement was enough. Tomorrow would bring new battles, both technical and political, but tonight belonged to the Liberty and the dedicated team that had brought it from concept to reality against formidable odds. Morning mist clung to the Virginia countryside as Colonel Thomas Sullivan stood atop the small hill overlooking the testing facility. A week had passed since the Liberty tank's successful demonstration, a week of anxious waiting for the political machinery in Washington to respond. From this vantage point, Sullivan could see the tank itself, parked outside the main workshop, its olive-drab paint catching the first rays of dawn sunlight. At 46, Sullivan felt older than his years. The war injuries that plagued him had eased somewhat with Eleanor's natural remedies replacing most of his morphine usage, but the deeper scars remained. Every night still brought dreams of France, of men burning inside disabled tanks, their screams cutting through his sleep. The Liberty tank represented more than engineering achievement. It was his atonement, his attempt to ensure fewer soldiers would suffer similar fates in the next conflict. "Beautiful morning," came Sam Reynolds' voice, as the elderly engineer climbed the hill with surprising vigor for his 75 years. The kind that makes you believe all's right with the world, despite evidence to the contrary. Sullivan smiled at his mentor. "You're up early, Sam." "Old men need less sleep," Reynolds replied, coming to stand beside Sullivan. And I wanted to catch you before the others arrived. Word came through Mitchell's channels last night. General Hartwell has formally recommended the Liberty for extended field trials. Sullivan felt a surge of cautious optimism. That's significant progress. Hartwell was firmly in the anti-mechanization camp before our demonstration. Reynolds nodded, his white beard catching the morning light. The general may be traditional, but he's not blind to superior technology when he sees it. Unfortunately, his recommendation isn't the final word. Reed's backers are already mounting a counteroffensive. What kind of counteroffensive? Budget manipulation, Reynolds said grimly. They're arguing that field trials of the Liberty would require diverting funds from established weapons programs, creating dangerous gaps in national defense readiness. It's clever. They don't have to attack the tank's capabilities directly, just make it financially unpalatable. Sullivan frowned but wasn't surprised. Mitchell anticipated this. That's why we've been working with private investors. Yes, but private funding can only take us so far, Reynolds reminded him. Eventually, we need the Army's full backing for production at scale. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a dust-covered automobile speeding up the facility's access road. Sullivan recognized it as Mitchell's personal vehicle. The congressman's unscheduled appearance at this early hour suggested urgent developments. As Mitchell emerged from the car, Sullivan could see tension in the politician's normally composed features. Without waiting for Sullivan and Reynolds to descend from the hill, Mitchell called up to them, his voice carrying in the still morning air. They've made their move, Mitchell announced without preamble. Reed convinced the War Department Budget Committee to freeze all funds for new armored vehicle development pending a comprehensive strategic review. It's effectively a 12-month delay designed to kill the Liberty through inaction. Sullivan felt a cold anger crystallizing in his chest. After all their work, after the Liberty's flawless performance, they were still being stymied by political maneuvering and entrenched interests. There has to be a way around this, he said as they walked toward the main facility. Mitchell nodded briskly. There is, but it's unorthodox and carries significant risks. Our private backers are willing to fund a more extensive demonstration, not just for military officials, but for members of Congress, the press, and selected foreign military attachés. Foreign attachés? Reynolds echoed with surprise. You're suggesting we showcase American military technology to other nations? Only our allies, Mitchell clarified. British, French, perhaps the Belgians. The strategy is straightforward. If foreign military observers express strong interest in the Liberty, it becomes harder for Reed's faction to justify killing the project. They might oppose tanks on doctrinal grounds, but they won't stand by while America loses a potential export advantage to European manufacturers. Sullivan considered this approach, recognizing both its cleverness and its dangers. Reed will characterize it as borderline treason, exposing military secrets to foreign powers. Which is why we need to be selective about what we demonstrate, Mitchell agreed. Show the Liberty's capabilities, but keep the most innovative technical aspects classified. It's a balancing act, but one I believe we can navigate. As they entered the main workshop, they found Charlie already at work, reviewing the maintenance logs from the previous demonstration. Over the past months, Sullivan had watched his son grow from a talented but inexperienced officer into a capable leader who commanded respect from the entire team. The strained formality that had initially characterized their relationship had given way to mutual professional admiration, with occasional glimpses of the deeper familial bond they were gradually rebuilding. "Morning, Father," Charlie greeted him, setting aside the logs. "Congressman Mitchell, Mr. Reynolds." His gaze moved from one face to another, reading their expressions. "Trouble in Washington?" Sullivan briefly explained the budget freeze and Mitchell's proposed response. Charlie's reaction was immediate and concerned. "Foreign observers? Father, that would place us in a legally precarious position. The Liberty contains classified elements, regardless of our current unofficial status, which is why we need to carefully determine what we show and what we conceal," Sullivan acknowledged. "If we proceed with this plan, and that's still an if, we'll need to create a demonstration version with certain features modified or removed." The discussion continued as the rest of the team arrived. Dr. Freeman and Eleanor Wright came together, deep in technical conversation about metallurgical improvements. Jack O'Malley followed shortly after, looking healthier and more focused than he had in months, the worst of his alcoholic episodes now behind him. The last to arrive was Klaus Weber, who had proven his value repeatedly in recent weeks through innovative solutions to persistent technical problems. Sullivan gathered everyone in the conference room, a Spartan space with a large table covered in blueprints and technical drawings. Mitchell explained the situation in Washington and his proposed countermeasure, eliciting varied reactions from the team. It's a political minefield, Freeman observed, his academic precision evident in how he framed the problem. But from a purely technical standpoint, we could create a demonstration variant that reveals our general approach without exposing the most sensitive innovations. O'Malley was more direct. You mean we build a dumbed-down version? Seems like a waste of resources when we should be refining the actual prototype. Not dumbed down, Eleanor corrected. Strategically modified. The core capabilities would remain intact, but the proprietary elements, like our composite armor formulation and the modified cooling system, would be replaced with more conventional alternatives. Sullivan watched Weber during this exchange, studying the German engineer's reactions. Weber had remained characteristically thoughtful, but Sullivan detected something else in his expression, a subtle calculation that raised questions about where his true loyalties might lie. Your thoughts, Herr Weber? Sullivan prompted. Yeah, Colonel. Curious how the former enemy officer would view the prospect of revealing American military technology to European powers. Weber met Sullivan's gaze directly. I understand the political strategy, but I must advise caution. European military attachés are exceptionally skilled at extracting technical information from even limited demonstrations. They will notice details you might not intend to reveal. You speak from experience? Mitchell asked, a slight edge to his voice. I do, Weber acknowledged without apology. Before the war, I was part of a German technical delegation that observed French artillery demonstrations. From seemingly innocuous details, the recoil behavior, the crew positioning, even the maintenance schedule, our engineers deduced significant aspects of their design approach. Sullivan appreciated the candor. Then you're the ideal person to help us determine what can be safely shown and what must be concealed. Your experience on both sides of such demonstrations gives you a unique perspective. The discussion continued, evolving from whether to proceed with the international demonstration to how it should be structured. By mid-morning, a tentative plan had emerged. They would develop a demonstration variant of the Liberty, one that showcased its mobility, firepower, and general configuration, while obscuring its most innovative technical features. The event would be scheduled for 3 weeks hence, giving them time to prepare both the modified tank and the facility itself. As the meeting concluded and the team dispersed to their respective tasks, Sullivan held Weber back. Walk with me, he suggested, leading the German engineer outside. They strolled toward the Liberty prototype, which sat in the morning sun like a steel sentinel. You've been an invaluable asset to this project, Sullivan began, choosing his words carefully. Your insights have solved problems that might have taken us months to overcome on our own. I appreciate the acknowledgement, Weber replied, but I sense there's more you wish to say. Sullivan nodded, deciding directness was the best approach. General Hartwell warned me to be careful about who I trust. He didn't name you specifically, but the implication was clear. If Weber was offended, he didn't show it. A reasonable concern. In his position, I would issue the same warning. And what would you say if you were in my position? Sullivan asked. How does one determine where true loyalties lie? Weber considered this as they circled the tank, his hand occasionally brushing against its armored hull with what seemed like genuine appreciation for the engineering. In engineering, we judge materials by how they perform under stress. Perhaps men should be judged similarly. He paused, then added, I am aware that my presence complicates your political situation. If you believe my departure would benefit the project, I will leave without protest. Sullivan was surprised by the offer and even more by the sincere way it was delivered. That won't be necessary, he decided. Your technical contributions outweigh the political complications, but I appreciate your willingness to put the project first. They completed their circuit of the Liberty in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. As they prepared to return to the workshop, Weber spoke again, his voice carrying an uncharacteristic emotional weight. When I gave you those designs in the Argonne Forest, it was not merely to preserve my work. It was because I believed technology should serve humanity, not political ideologies. The fatherland I loved had become something I no longer recognized. He met Sullivan's gaze directly. My loyalty now is to the future of armored warfare, not as an instrument of conquest, but as a means to end conflicts more quickly and with fewer casualties. If that aligns with your goals, then you have my full commitment. Sullivan studied Weber's face, searching for any sign of deception and finding none. Whether this represented genuine conviction or masterful manipulation, Sullivan couldn't be entirely certain. But in that moment, he chose to believe in the engineer's sincerity. "That aligns perfectly with my goals," Sullivan replied. "Let's make sure the Liberty fulfills that promise." The next 3 weeks passed in a blur of frantic activity. Creating the demonstration variant of the Liberty proved more complex than anticipated, requiring careful engineering compromises to conceal sensitive innovations while maintaining impressive performance. Eleanor and Dr. Freeman developed a modified armor configuration that appeared conventional but hinted at the advantages of their actual design. O'Malley recalibrated the engine to deliver less than the Liberty's full power potential while still outperforming existing tanks. Charlie coordinated with Mitchell's office to manage the logistical challenges of hosting foreign observers at a supposedly secret facility. Throughout this period, Sullivan observed Weber closely, looking for any behavior that might validate Hartwell's implied warning. But the German engineer worked tirelessly alongside the rest of the team, his suggestions consistently focused on enhancing the project's success rather than extracting additional information or undermining their efforts. 4 days before the scheduled demonstration, Sullivan received an unexpected visitor. A military staff car arrived at the facility's gate, its sole occupant, a stern-faced colonel in Army intelligence whom Sullivan had never met. Colonel James Donovan, the man introduced himself, showing credentials that identified him as Deputy Director of European Operations for Military Intelligence. "I need to speak with you privately, Colonel Sullivan. It concerns Klaus Weber." Sullivan led Donovan to his office, a Spartan space dominated by technical drawings and mechanical components. Once the door was closed, Donovan came directly to the point. "We have credible information that Weber is not who he appears to be," Donovan stated, placing a thin folder on Sullivan's desk. "His background as a German tank engineer is genuine, but our sources indicate he was recruited by German intelligence before his chance encounter with you in the Argonne." Sullivan opened the folder, finding surveillance photographs and translated intelligence reports. "You're suggesting he deliberately gave me those tank designs as part of a long-term operation?" "Precisely," Donovan confirmed. "German intelligence recognized that the war was lost, but were already planning for the future. They identified you as a potential conduit for monitoring American technological development. Weber's mission was to establish a relationship based on shared engineering interests, then exploit it to gain access to American military innovation." Sullivan considered this revelation, comparing it with his own observations of Weber's behavior over the past months. If that's true, why would German intelligence allow him to provide genuine advanced designs? Wouldn't that harm their own future capabilities? "A calculated sacrifice," Donovan explained. "Give away yesterday's innovations to gain access to tomorrow's breakthroughs." The designs he provided were already known to Allied intelligence through captured documents. What they truly seek is insight into how American engineering might evolve those concepts. The accusation was plausible, yet Sullivan remained skeptical. "What evidence supports this theory beyond circumstantial connections?" Donovan hesitated slightly. "I can't reveal our sources, but the intelligence is considered highly reliable. We've been monitoring Weber since his arrival in the United States. His communications pattern shows irregular but significant contact with individuals connected to the German embassy." "Communications about what?" "That's unclear," Donovan admitted. "The contacts are typically brief and in public locations that prevent our surveillance from capturing the content. But the pattern itself is consistent with intelligence tradecraft." Sullivan leaned back in his chair, processing this information. "What are you asking me to do, Colonel Donovan?" "Ideally, remove Weber from the project immediately. At minimum, restrict his access to sensitive information and exclude him from the upcoming demonstration." Donovan's expression hardened slightly. "I should note that I have the authority to detain him as a suspected foreign agent, but I'd prefer to handle this discreetly given the political sensitivities surrounding your project." Sullivan nodded, appreciating the consideration. "I'll need 24 hours to make arrangements that won't disrupt our schedule. The demonstration is too important to cancel or postpone." 24 hours, Donovan agreed, standing to leave. "No longer, and Sullivan, watch yourself. Men like Weber are trained to build trust before they exploit it." After Donovan's departure, Sullivan sat alone in his office. The intelligence folder opened before him. The accusations against Weber were serious and came from credible sources, yet they contradicted Sullivan's personal assessment of the man. Weber had repeatedly demonstrated commitment to the project, often working longer hours than anyone else and contributing innovations that had dramatically improved the Liberty's capabilities. Was it possible that everything, the technical brilliance, the apparent dedication, even the philosophical discussions about technology serving humanity, was an elaborate deception? Or was Donovan's intelligence flawed, perhaps influenced by lingering anti-German sentiment or bureaucratic rivalries between military departments? Sullivan was still wrestling with these questions when Charlie entered the office, immediately sensing his father's troubled state. "What's wrong?" Charlie asked, closing the door behind him. Sullivan briefly summarized Donovan's visit and accusations, watching his son's reaction carefully. Charlie had developed a professional respect for Weber, but had always maintained a certain distance, never fully embracing the German engineer as other team members had. "I'm not entirely surprised," Charlie admitted. "I've noticed patterns in Weber's behavior. Nothing definitive, but small inconsistencies that raise questions. The way he sometimes asks tangential questions that probe our broader technological approach rather than focusing on the immediate problem. His particular interest in how we might scale production beyond the Liberty to other armored vehicles. Those could be the natural inquiries of a thorough engineer," Sullivan pointed out. "They could," Charlie acknowledged, "but combined with Donovan's intelligence." He trailed off, then asked the crucial question. "What are you going to do?" Sullivan closed the folder, his decision crystallizing. "I'm going to confront him directly. Tonight, after the others have left. If he's the intelligence operative Donovan believes, I want to see his reaction when challenged without preparation." "That's risky," Charlie cautioned. "If he is a German agent, confronting him could force his hand, potentially endangering the project or even yourself." "It's a risk I need to take," Sullivan replied. "I've led this team based on trust and technical merit. I won't discard a valuable member based on suspicions and circumstantial evidence without giving him a chance to defend himself." Charlie nodded, respecting his father's decision, though not necessarily agreeing with it. "I'll be nearby when you speak with him, just in case." Evening brought a spectacular sunset that painted the Virginia sky in shades of amber and crimson, casting long shadows across the testing grounds. Most of the team had departed for their temporary housing in a nearby town, leaving only Sullivan, Charlie, and Weber at the facility. Sullivan found the German engineer in the workshop, making final adjustments to the demonstration variant's turret rotation mechanism. "A word, Herr Weber?" Sullivan requested, his tone deliberately neutral. Weber looked up from his work, setting aside his tools with methodical precision. "Of course, Colonel." Sullivan led him to a small side office, aware that Charlie had positioned himself unobtrusively nearby, within earshot but out of sight. Once inside, Sullivan closed the door and came directly to the point. "I received a visit from Army intelligence today," he stated, watching Weber's reaction carefully. "They believe you're operating as a German intelligence asset, using this project to gather information on American military technology." If Weber was surprised or alarmed by the accusation, he concealed it masterfully. His expression remained composed, though Sullivan detected a subtle shift in his posture, a slight straightening of the spine, a tension in the shoulders that hadn't been there moments before. "I see," Weber responded after a measured pause. "May I ask what evidence supports this assertion?" "Communications with German embassy personnel, a pattern consistent with intelligence tradecraft." Sullivan held Weber's gaze steadily. "Is it true?" Weber didn't answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the room's small window, looking out at the Liberty tanks silhouetted against the sunset. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter but remarkably even. "It's partially true," he admitted. "I was approached by German intelligence before my deployment to the Western Front. They identified me as someone who could potentially provide technical information on Allied armor capabilities. I agreed to cooperate." Sullivan felt a complex mixture of disappointment and vindication. "So our entire relationship, from the Argonne Forest to this moment, has been an operation?" Weber turned back to face him. "No, that's where the partial truth ends and the complexity begins." He drew a deep breath before continuing. "I did agree to cooperate with German intelligence, but not for the reasons they believed. My family in Dresden was vulnerable. My wife is Jewish. My cooperation was the price of their safety." This revelation caught Sullivan by surprise, complicating the straightforward narrative Donovan had presented. "And now, why continue the association here in America?" "Because Germany lost the war, but the threats remain," Weber explained. "My family managed to reach Switzerland, but their security is still precarious. German intelligence maintains contact because they believe I'm still their asset. I maintain contact because breaking it completely might endanger my family. What information have you provided them? Sullivan demanded. The engineer in him temporarily superseded by the military officer responsible for a classified project. Technical details they already possess from captured equipment and documents, Weber replied. Insights they could obtain from any competent analysis of Allied tanks. Nothing proprietary, nothing that would compromise the Liberty's unique advantages. Sullivan studied the German carefully, looking for signs of deception, but finding only a weary resignation. Why tell me this now? Why not continue the pretense? A ghost of a smile crossed Weber's face. Because you asked directly, Colonel, and because, despite our different paths, I believe we share the same fundamental goal, advancing armored technology to save soldiers' lives rather than simply to kill more efficiently. He paused. Also, because I suspected this moment would eventually come. Intelligence services are thorough, if not always accurate, in their interpretations. What would you have me do with this information? Sullivan asked, genuinely uncertain about the appropriate response. Weber had essentially confirmed he was a foreign agent, yet the context complicated any straightforward action. That depends on what you value most, Weber replied. If absolute security is your priority, then Colonel Donovan is right. You should remove me from the project immediately. If the Liberty's technical advancement matters more, then perhaps we can find a compromise that protects your interests while allowing me to continue contributing. The door opened before Sullivan could respond, revealing Charlie with his service pistol drawn but held discreetly at his side. I heard enough, he said, his expression grim but controlled. He's admitted to being a German agent, Father. Weber didn't appear surprised by Charlie's intervention. A prudent precaution, he acknowledged, nodding toward the pistol. Though unnecessary, I assure you. Sullivan made a quick decision. Secure him in the storage room for tonight. No communication with anyone outside this facility. To Weber, he added, I need time to consider the full implications of what you've told me. As Charlie escorted Weber from the room, Sullivan remained behind, wrestling with the competing imperatives of security, technical progress, and his own instinctive assessment of Weber's character. The German had admitted to espionage, yet claimed to have protected the Liberty's most important innovations. His explanation about family vulnerability rang true, yet could easily be a calculated play for sympathy. Sullivan was still deliberating when a distant explosion shattered the evening quiet, followed immediately by the staccato sound of small arms fire. Running outside, he saw flames erupting from the facility's main gate, where two vehicles had crashed through the perimeter fence. Armed men in civilian clothing were advancing toward the workshop area, firing at the few security personnel Mitchell had assigned to the facility. Charlie appeared at his side, pistol now raised and ready. 4 vehicles, at least 12 armed men, he reported tersely. They breached the northeast gate. Security's engaging, but they're outnumbered. Sullivan's military training took over, his mind rapidly assessing options. Where's Weber? Secured in the storage room as ordered, Charlie replied. What about the Liberty? Sullivan glanced toward the prototype tank, understanding immediately that it must be the attacker's primary objective. We need to move it. Get O'Malley on the radio. He's the only one besides you and Weber who can operate it effectively. I'll try to slow them down. As Charlie ran toward the communications building, Sullivan retrieved his own service pistol from his office and took position behind a stack of steel plating. The attackers were moving with disciplined precision, using covering fire to advance methodically toward the workshop. Their tactics suggested military training, though their civilian attire provided no clues to their affiliation. Sullivan fired carefully, making each shot count, but he was one man against many. He managed to hit one attacker in the leg, disrupting their advance momentarily, but they quickly adapted, focusing suppressive fire on his position to pin him down. Through the chaos, Sullivan caught glimpses of the main workshop where the Liberty waited. If the attackers captured the tank intact, they would gain access to every innovation his team had developed. The demonstration variant lacked the most sensitive features, but the original prototype contained the full spectrum of their advancements. Sullivan was considering a desperate dash toward the workshop when he heard the unmistakable sound of the Liberty's engine roaring to life. Through the smoke and gathering darkness, he saw the tank's outline moving, its turret rotating toward the attackers. Relief flooded through him. Charlie must have reached O'Malley in time. The Liberty emerged from the workshop, its bulk silhouetted against the flames. The attackers immediately concentrated their fire on it, but small arms had minimal effect against its armored hull. The tank's machine gun opened fire, forcing the attackers to seek cover. For a moment, Sullivan thought the tide had turned in their favor. Then a new sound cut through the chaos, the distinctive whoosh of a rocket launcher. Sullivan watched in horror as a projectile streaked toward the Liberty, striking it at the junction between hull and turret. The explosion wasn't catastrophic, but it clearly damaged the turret rotation mechanism, leaving the tank partially disabled. Despite the damage, the Liberty continued to advance, using its bulk to force the attackers back. Sullivan used the opportunity to move to a new position with better visibility. As he did, he caught sight of the tank's open commander's hatch, expecting to see O'Malley or Charlie. Instead, he glimpsed Weber's face, intent with concentration as he directed the tank's movements. Sullivan froze momentarily in confusion. Weber had been secured in the storage room. How was he now operating the Liberty, and where were Charlie and O'Malley? The answer came seconds later as Charlie appeared beside him, breathing hard. "Couldn't reach O'Malley," he reported, "but I found the storage room empty. Weber must have picked the lock." "He's in the tank," Sullivan said, pointing toward the Liberty, which was now engaging the attackers directly, forcing them into a chaotic retreat. Charlie's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "He's stealing it. The German agents must have staged this attack to create an opportunity for him to escape with the prototype." Sullivan considered this possibility, watching as the Liberty continued to advance, not toward the perimeter where the attackers had breached, but directly at the attackers themselves, forcing them back toward their vehicles. If Weber intended to steal the tank, he was moving in exactly the wrong direction. "No," Sullivan decided, "he's defending it. Look at his tactics. He's using the Liberty to drive them off, not escape with it." Charlie appeared unconvinced, but before he could argue further, a second rocket streaked toward the tank. This time, Weber saw it coming and managed to maneuver the Liberty so that the projectile struck at an angle, glancing off the sloped armor rather than penetrating. The partial success of the second rocket attack seemed to discourage the remaining attackers. They began a coordinated withdrawal, laying covering fire as they retreated toward their vehicles. Within minutes, they had disengaged completely, speeding away into the darkness. Sullivan and Charlie approached the Liberty cautiously, unsure of Weber's intentions now that the immediate threat had passed. The tank's engine continued to rumble as they drew near, but its weapons remained silent. Slowly, the commander's hatch opened fully, and Weber emerged, his hands raised to show he was unarmed. "The attack is over, Colonel," Weber called down from his position. "I believe they were attempting to either capture or destroy the prototype." "Step down from the tank," Sullivan ordered, his pistol still at the ready. Slowly, Weber complied, descending carefully from the Liberty's hull. Once on the ground, he made no attempt to flee or resist as Charlie secured his hands behind his back. "You were supposed to be locked in the storage room," Sullivan said, studying the German carefully. "A simple pin tumbler lock," Weber replied with a slight shrug. "Any engineer with steady hands could bypass it. When I heard the explosion, I thought my background might be useful in the circumstances." Sullivan had to acknowledge the truth in that statement. Weber's military experience combined with his engineering knowledge had enabled him to operate the Liberty effectively in combat conditions, likely saving the prototype from capture or destruction. "Who were they?" Sullivan demanded. "German operatives come to extract you in the tank?" Weber shook his head emphatically. "Not German. Their tactics were all wrong for German special operations. And if I were coordinating with them, why would I fight against them?" "To maintain your cover," Charlie suggested, though his tone held less conviction than before. "At the cost of the operation itself? That makes no tactical sense." Weber turned back to Sullivan. "I suspect these were mercenaries hired by whoever is backing Colonel Reed, defense contractors threatened by the Liberty's potential to disrupt their established business." The theory aligned with Sullivan's own assessment of the attackers' tactics and targets. Before he could respond, headlights appeared on the access road, reinforcements arriving from the nearby town, alerted by the sound of gunfire. Among the approaching vehicles, Sullivan recognized Congressman Mitchell's automobile. Within minutes, the facility was swarming with Mitchell's security personnel and local law enforcement. Mitchell himself found Sullivan standing beside the damaged but intact Liberty, with Charlie still guarding the restrained Weber. "Thank God you're all right," Mitchell exclaimed, surveying the scene with obvious concern. "When we heard the gunfire," he trailed off, noticing Weber's restraints. "What's happening here?" Sullivan briefly explained both Weber's admission of German intelligence connections and his subsequent defense of the Liberty during the attack. Mitchell listened intently, his political mind clearly calculating implications and options. This complicates matters, Mitchell observed once Sullivan had finished. We have a demonstration scheduled in 3 days with foreign observers already en route. Weber's status as a potential foreign agent creates significant security concerns, yet his actions tonight suggest his primary loyalty is to the project itself. I still don't trust him, Charlie stated flatly. One heroic act doesn't erase his admission of espionage. Weber remained silent, neither defending himself nor protesting his treatment. His calm demeanor in the face of such accusations struck Sullivan as either remarkable self-control or the confidence of a man who knew his true value to the project. We need to make a decision, Sullivan said finally. Continue with the demonstration as planned, cancel it entirely, or proceed without Weber's involvement. Mitchell considered the options. Canceling sends precisely the wrong message. It suggests vulnerability or lack of confidence in the Liberty. Proceeding without Weber risks technical complications if issues arise that only he fully understands. The congressman turned to Weber directly. If we allow you to participate, what assurance can you provide that you won't use this opportunity to compromise sensitive information? Only my word, Weber replied simply. And the observable fact that if my primary goal were to compromise the Liberty, I've had ample opportunity to do so without resorting to dramatic midnight heroics. Sullivan made his decision based not on absolute certainty, but on the practical necessities of the moment and his own assessment of Weber's character. He stays with the project and participates in the demonstration, but under continuous supervision. Charlie, you'll be responsible for monitoring his activities and communications. Charlie nodded, accepting the assignment, though his expression suggested continued reservations. Weber gave no reaction beyond a slight nod of acknowledgement. Mitchell appeared satisfied with the compromise. I'll have my security team investigate tonight's attackers. If we can establish a connection to Reed or his industrial backers, it would provide powerful ammunition against their efforts to block the Liberty. As emergency vehicles arrived and the cleanup began, Sullivan took a moment to inspect the Liberty for damage. The rocket impact had destroyed part of the turret ring assembly, but the tank remained operational and could be repaired before the demonstration. More importantly, none of the prototype's most innovative components had been compromised. Weber joined him in the inspection, still under Charlie's watchful eye. The damage is repairable, the German engineer assessed. We'll need to replace the turret-bearing assembly, but that's relatively straightforward. Sullivan nodded in agreement, then asked the question that had been troubling him since Weber's revelation. Why did you really give me those designs in the Argonne Forest? Was it truly about preserving engineering work? Or was it the beginning of an intelligence operation? Weber considered the question carefully before answering. Both, in different measures. German intelligence wanted me to establish a connection that could be exploited later. I wanted to ensure that if Germany lost the war, the best tank designs wouldn't be lost with it. He paused. But neither explanation is complete. In that moment, bleeding in the mud, I was also simply one engineer recognizing another. Someone who might appreciate the work for its own merit, regardless of which flag flew over it. Sullivan found himself believing this explanation, complex as it was with its mixture of professional respect, operational calculation, and human connection formed in the chaos of battle. And now, where do your loyalties truly lie? With the advancement of armored technology, Weber replied without hesitation, national borders and political ideologies matter less to me now than seeing these machines fulfill their potential to reduce warfare's cost in human lives. He smiled slightly. That sounds idealistic, I know, but engineers are often idealists beneath our practical exteriors. Sullivan recognized the truth in that observation. His own dedication to the Liberty stemmed not just from professional pride or patriotic duty, but from the haunting memories of young men dying in burning tanks, men who might have survived with better design and technology. We'll proceed with the demonstration, Sullivan decided, speaking to both Weber and Charlie. Whatever complications your background creates, Weber, your technical contributions remain valuable. Just understand that trust, once questioned, must be re-earned through actions, not words. Weber nodded in acceptance of these terms. I understand completely, Colonel. The next 3 days passed in a blur of frantic activity. Repairing the Liberty, Securing the facility against further attacks and preparing for the international demonstration consumed every waking hour. Sullivan barely slept, dividing his time between technical oversight and security concerns. Throughout this period, Weber worked tirelessly under Charlie's supervision, never complaining about the restrictions or surveillance. The morning of the demonstration dawned clear and bright, a perfect Virginia spring day. Vehicles began arriving early, military staff cars carrying American officers, diplomatic automobiles with foreign attachés, even several press vehicles authorized by Mitchell to document the event. By mid-morning, nearly 100 observers had gathered, representing a cross-section of military, political, and industrial interests. Sullivan, dressed once again in his full Army uniform, stood beside the repaired Liberty as Mitchell made introductory remarks to the assembled dignitaries. Scanning the crowd, Sullivan noted the British military attaché, Colonel Harrington, conversing quietly with his French counterpart. Several American congressmen stood together near the front, their expressions revealing varying degrees of interest and skepticism. In the back row, partially obscured but unmistakable, stood Lieutenant Colonel Reed, his face set in a mask of professional detachment that didn't quite hide his displeasure at the proceedings. The demonstration itself proceeded flawlessly. Sullivan provided a technical overview of the Liberty's capabilities while Charlie demonstrated its mobility across challenging terrain. Weber, operating under Charlie's supervision, explained the tank's mechanical innovations using carefully prepared statements that revealed impressive capabilities without exposing proprietary details. The response was everything Mitchell had hoped for. The foreign observers showed clear interest, particularly when the Liberty demonstrated its superior speed and maneuverability compared to existing French and British designs. The American congressmen, initially reserved, became increasingly engaged as they witnessed the practical advantages of the Liberty over the tanks currently in U.S. military service. Even more satisfying was Reed's visible frustration as the demonstration progressed successfully. Sullivan caught the intelligence officer making notes throughout the proceedings, presumably documenting perceived security violations that could be used to justify further obstruction. As the formal demonstration concluded, Sullivan found himself surrounded by foreign military officials asking technical questions. He navigated these inquiries carefully, providing substantive responses that demonstrated American technological capability without revealing sensitive details. Throughout these discussions, he noted Weber maintaining a similar balance in his own conversations, informative but discreet. The culmination came when General Hartwell himself arrived, having delayed his appearance until he could assess the demonstration's reception. The general's presence sent a clear signal that the Liberty had gained significant support within the military establishment. When Hartwell approached Sullivan, his typically stern expression had softened slightly. "Impressive work, Colonel Sullivan," Hartwell acknowledged. "The Liberty exceeds the performance parameters you claimed, and the foreign interest is undeniable." "Thank you, sir," Sullivan replied. "Does this change the War Department's position on the project?" Hartwell glanced toward Reed, who stood rigidly nearby. "Let's just say the Budget Committee will be receiving revised recommendations from my office. The strategic value of maintaining American leadership in armored technology has become more apparent." It wasn't an unqualified endorsement, but it represented a significant shift from the general's previous skepticism. Sullivan recognized the political reality. Hartwell was offering support while maintaining plausible distance from a project that still faced powerful opposition. As the attendees began departing, Mitchell joined Sullivan, his politician's smile barely concealing his satisfaction. "We've achieved our objective," he said quietly. "The foreign interest was obvious enough that our Congressional Appropriations Committee can't ignore it. Reed's faction will still fight us, but they have lost the advantage." Sullivan nodded, feeling a cautious optimism. "What happens next?" "Political maneuvering in Washington," Mitchell replied. "Not your concern. Your job is to refine the Liberty's design and prepare for official Army field trials, which I can now guarantee will be funded." He clasped Sullivan's shoulder. "You've won the engineering battle, Colonel. Let me handle the political war." The facility gradually emptied as the dignitaries departed, leaving only Sullivan's core team and a few of Mitchell's staff to begin the cleanup process. Charlie approached, accompanied by Weber. "The demonstration was a success by any measure," Charlie reported. "Even the most skeptical observers were impressed by the Liberty's performance." Sullivan nodded in agreement. "And Weber, how did he handle himself?" "Professionally," Charlie admitted, though reluctance colored his tone. "He stayed within the approved technical parameters in all discussions, even when foreign engineers attempted to draw him out on more sensitive topics. Weber accepted this assessment with a slight nod. I understand my position remains probationary, Colonel. I intend to continue earning your trust through actions rather than assertions. Before Sullivan could respond, one of Mitchell's aides approached with an urgent expression. Colonel Sullivan, we've just received word from Washington. The War Department has officially reinstated Project Freedom Forge with full funding for field trials and pre-production development. The news sent a wave of excitement through the team members within earshot. Sullivan felt a profound sense of vindication. All their work, all the obstacles overcome, had finally resulted in official recognition and support. There's more, the aide continued. General Pershing himself has requested that you report to Washington next week to brief the General Staff on the Liberty's potential applications in future military planning. This represented more than just project approval. It suggested the Liberty was being considered not as an experimental curiosity, but as a fundamental component of American military strategy. Sullivan glanced at Reynolds, seeing the same realization in the old engineer's eyes. We did it, Thomas, Reynolds said quietly. Not just a tank, but a new direction for American armored warfare. Sullivan nodded, momentarily overwhelmed by the culmination of their efforts. He thought back to that muddy trench in the Argonne Forest, to a dying German officer passing designs to an American engineer. From that chance encounter had grown not just a superior tank, but potentially a new era in military technology. The team gathered around Sullivan, each face showing a mixture of exhaustion and triumph. Eleanor and Freeman standing side by side, their technical partnership having evolved into something deeper over the months of collaboration. O'Malley, sober and focused, his brilliance no longer undermined by personal demons. Charlie having grown from Sullivan's son into a capable officer and leader in his own right. Weber, the outsider whose contributions had proven essential despite the complications of his background. And Reynolds, the mentor whose experience and wisdom had guided them through countless challenges. This isn't an ending, Sullivan told them. It's a beginning. The Liberty is just the first step in what American armored technology can achieve. There will be more battles ahead, technical, political, and perhaps someday military. But what we've created here will save American lives in those future conflicts. As the Virginia sunset painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Sullivan stood beside the Liberty tank, their Liberty tank. The machine represented not just American engineering prowess, but the power of diverse expertise united by common purpose. A former Ford engineer, a Civil War veteran, a female MIT graduate, a black scientist, a troubled mechanical genius, a young Air Service officer, and even a German tank designer. Each had contributed essential elements to create something greater than any could have achieved alone. Whatever the future held, whatever challenges still awaited, Sullivan knew the Liberty would stand as testament to what could be accomplished when innovation was valued above tradition and human ingenuity allowed to flourish beyond the constraints of bureaucracy and politics. In that moment, watching his team gathered around their creation as twilight settled over the Virginia countryside, Colonel Thomas Sullivan felt a peace that had eluded him since his return from war, the satisfaction of having built something that mattered, something that would endure.